Good afternoon, and welcome to the Christopher C. Gibbs College of Architecture at the University of Oklahoma. And thanks to so many of you who have traveled near and far for what is truly a momentous afternoon, a momentous occasion, a celebration of sorts. And we're so thrilled that all of you have decided to choose to share part of your afternoon to be with us. This is a very important foothold in our development and our evolution. We meet in order to understand our past so that we don't repeat it and to discover an even better future. Do not try to remember. This is the dictum that Bruce Goff offered as a means to position history in the pursuit of individual creativity and innovation in architecture. It may also help explain how a band of passionate educators here at the University of Oklahoma may have discovered a way of thinking and practice that continues to be relevant and inspiring today. A new school, probably the only indigenous one in the United States, is how OU alum and renowned architect Donald McDonald once characterized the school of thought that developed here under Bruce Goff, Herb Greene, and many others in the 1940s and 50s. McDonald went on to write, "A truly American ethic, which is being formulated without the usual influence of the European or Asian architectural forms and methodologies common on the east or west coasts of the United States. What is it? The American School. A transcending school of thought. Three characteristics define the American school work and which remain as our shared ethos here at the Christopher C. Gibbs College of Architecture. The work could be described as resourceful, using local materials, everyday objects, scrap, industrial materials. The work could be described as experimental. Forms were always original and often otherworldly, and certainly contextual. The architecture of the American school responds to particular sites and clients and social and environmental contexts. And if you have a moment after this symposium, we invite you to look at some of the exhibits just outside of the gallery here to see not only examples, more drawings of work from the American School, but also some of the work we do today, which we believe is an extension inspired by the American School. But the American School approach was not readily accepted by critics who preferred to exalt the European imports. And today, we are trying to change that fact. We are working to bring the incredible creative legacy of the American School to light. In the last 3 years, our team has organized 2 major exhibitions, one in Venice, Italy, and that was the easy one, and one currently on display at OU's Bizzell Memorial Library. We have organized 3 installations here in Gould Hall, 2 symposia, and 3 special courses on this important history. Our team has presented this research across the country through invited lectures, conference papers, and this coming June as a 1.5 health, safety, and welfare credit earning session at the AI Conference in Architecture in Las Vegas. Hope to see you in Vegas. We have partnered with OU Libraries, great partners with OU Libraries, to create what we believe is such an important piece to our work, the American School Archive. And we've received countless collections, additions from dozens of architects. We just received another stack of amazing drawings from Arlie. Where are you today? Thank you, Arlie. We've partnered with the Fred Jones Jr. Museum here on campus to organize a major exhibition that opens in January of 2020. And we've partnered with OU Press to author a scholarly catalog to accompany this 2020 exhibition. As these examples illustrate, this is a team project. We have been incredibly fortunate to have the enthusiastic support and help of faculty, students, and staff here and beyond. We're enjoying incredible support from the provost's office and the university president himself. They all believe that this American school is worth investing in still. I invite any faculty in here to stand if you have been a part of this American School project so far. Please stand, any faculty. Don't be bashful. Thank you. If you're a student, students who have been a part of this process so far, please stand. Any of you contributors in here today, don't be bashful. And of course, the backbone of any worthy organization are staff. Staff, please stand if you're here. And if they're not here, it's probably because they're busy running the show outside of this room. We are truly grateful to our staff, Camille Germany and Stephanie Soash particularly. There's so many others out there who are making this happen. No one of us could do this work alone. It takes an incredible range of talent, expertise, skills, and yes, funding to make this work. And we're just getting started. And now I'd like to shift and take a moment to introduce our keynote speaker today, Dr. Christopher Mead. Dr. Mead is a distinguished architectural historian who earned his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. He is the Dean Emeritus, much smarter than I, of the College of Fine Arts at the University of New Mexico, where he taught for over 30 years. He is one of the most important scholars of modern American architecture today. He served as the president of the Society of Architectural Historians, and he has authored the most important scholarship on the work of Bart Prince, as well as published books and articles on the work of Robert Venturi, Charles Garnier, and Antoine Prédoc, among others. Our forthcoming catalog opens with an essay by Dr. Mead, in which he describes the architects of the American School as renegades. We were so utterly convinced by Dr. Mead's characterization that we renamed the book Renegades, Bruce Goff and the American School of Architecture. We're honored to have Dr. Mead here today, and I hope you'll please help me welcome Dr. Christopher Mead.
Thank you, Dean Butcher, for that kind introduction. Not deserved, but I'll take it. And thank you also to Stephanie Pilat and Luca Guido for inviting me here today. Can you all hear me? If you're way back, you want to move forward unless you have really good eyesight. All right. When it didn't matter, this worked. Yeah, I'd rather try it with that because this is even more dangerous with my eyesight. Maybe this, no? All right, tech, help. Some reason the laptop is not, it's ignoring my instructions. It knows I'm not from here. It says, I don't do what you tell me to do. See, I do that. You see, it's not just me. So we're good now? And with this one too? Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Yeah, no, that was good, that was good. I want to go ahead to that. It won't go back. All right, so there we go. All right. So I've been asked to speak about the New Mexican architect, Bart Prince. He has been a practicing architect for nearly 50 years now. He has built all over the country, primarily in New Mexico and California, but also Idaho and Ohio. His architecture is often called organic I put that in scare quotes because it's a reference that makes sense to us. The imaginative geometry, dramatic structures, the inventive use of materials all fit our preconception of what organic architecture is, going back to Frank Lloyd Wright. And Prince has himself admired the work of Frank Lloyd Wright since he discovered him in middle school when he was 14 years old. But if you want to annoy Bart, say, your architecture is organic, isn't it? And he will immediately disclaim that label because it suggests that what he does is copy Wright's architecture, that there is something called the Wright style of architecture, and calling him an organic architect means that he is copying Frank Lloyd Wright. And for Bart, copying someone else's work misses the whole point of what he does, of what Wright did before him, and indeed what any architect should do. Good architecture, as far as he's concerned, never, ever, ever comes from copying a style. For him, good architecture must come from something that in one sense is simpler, although it is really very difficult. It must come from responding to the demands of a client's program, a client's budget, and the site, without preconceptions. And that's the kicker, because most of the time we have preconceptions. Wright's own teacher, Louis Sullivan, put it this way in the kindergarten chats, quote, "Every problem contains and suggests its own solution. In this mental attitude lies the technical beginning of understanding." When I was writing one of my books about Bart, I asked him what he thought about this quotation from Louis Sullivan, and he wrote back to me, so I have his answer recorded. He wrote, quote, "The quote of Louis Sullivan is usually taken very literally, as though there will be only one solution to any given problem. The statement that it is a mental attitude is the important one." Now, he's really saying two things that are linked to each other. One is that every problem contains not just one solution, but many possible solutions. Keep in mind, we're starting without preconceptions here. The challenge each time is to find the best possible solution to the problem within the context of that particular project, client, site, budget, and so on. So you could actually solve the same problem in a very different way. In other words, every design starts from zero. It doesn't start from anything before it. It starts right when you are designing, which is why Bart says it's really about a mental attitude, not a mental image, because it doesn't look like anything. It is a way of thinking. And I'd like to suggest that Bart's response to my question captures both the problem-solving logic and the willingness to experiment that characterizes his architecture. Now, in my talk today, I'm going to try and summarize that logic with 5 principles of pragmatic design. I probably have the confidence to do that because I'm in Oklahoma and he's in New Mexico, so he can't stop me halfway through and say, "No, you don't have it right." But let me try to do with these 5 principles. The first is that, and I've already suggested this, but every design is specific to its site. It responds directly to the immediate conditions of its topography, its climate, its orientation, and its context. And I'm going to talk a lot more about context, but context is both a natural and a cultural condition. Second, every design is specific to its client. It responds directly to the client's program and the client's budget. Third, every design is an integrated system of spaces that connect interior and exterior. Fourth, every design integrates those spaces with a structure that is specific to the materials used. Space, structure, and materials form an integrated whole. Now keep in mind that all these principles are building upon each other, so we're getting something that's more and more layered as we go along. And therefore, fifth, and it's almost inevitable if you understand the first four principles, every design is unique. Each design is an original solution to the specific conditions of site, client, site, structure, and materials within the context in which the architect designed them. Now, I hope if you've been paying attention, you notice that one thing I didn't mention in laying out these principles was form. For Prince, form results from the design process. Form is the result of a building's spaces and structure and site and client and budget rather than the other way around. It's easy to say, it is sort of mind-boggling to consider how you do it because you don't know what your project is going to look like when you start designing. It ends up looking like something, but it is really about a system of spaces and structure and materials. So what I want to do today is give you some idea of how this works out. I want to explore Bart's pragmatic method of design by looking at three houses that he designed between 1984 and 2006. I'm going to organize my talk into three parts. First, I want to talk a little bit about Bart's background and some of the formative influences on his thinking as an architect. And yes, I will soon get to Goff. You're kind of wondering, where's Goff in all of this? He's there, don't worry. Second, I want to look at his own house and studio as a kind of portrait of him as an architect, and I should say architect as artist. And third, I want to look at two other houses, the Price House in California and the Whitmore residence in northern New Mexico, to see how he responds to both the natural and cultural context of his projects. And out of this, I'd like to suggest that he creates a very American architecture. An architecture that is grounded in both the natural and cultural conditions of place that have shaped the American landscape for hundreds of years now. Can everybody hear me? Okay, you can more or less see the slides. Good. Can you still see them? We're going to get some, there's going to be some small ones in here as we go along. It's okay? Bart Prince is a fourth-generation New Mexican. Now, since New Mexico has one of the oldest histories of continuous inhabitation in North America, that goes back to the Chacoan culture that started building structures that still exist from somewhere between the 7th and 9th century. When I say he's a fourth generation, it ain't nothing, but in context of New Mexico, it is something if you're Anglo or a white. He is one of the oldest white families in New Mexico. He is deeply rooted in that part of the world. His great-grandfather, LeBaron Bradford Prince, moved from New York State to New Mexico in 1878. Took the train to Trinidad, Colorado, which is as far as the train went, and then took a stagecoach the rest of the way to Santa Fe, where he served first as a territorial Supreme Court justice and then as a territorial governor of New Mexico. So the Prince family is a very famous family in the history of that state, and his great-grandfather was instrumental in statehood. LeBaron Bradford Prince lived, when he was a governor, in the Palace of the Governors. If you know Santa Fe, if you know the plaza, the Palace of the Governors is right there. And if you go there, you can see the Prince rooms, decorated more or less as what it looked like when he was living there. After he retired, he moved just up the street. So the Palace of the Governors is down there, but just up the street is the Prince residence. And it remained in the family until the mid to later 1950s. If you go to Santa Fe and you eat in the Shed restaurant, you're eating in the former Prince room, home. Bart remembers staying there as a child, staying with his grandfather, with whom he also spent the summers on his grandfather's ranch at Espanola outside of Santa Fe. Now, all is to say is he grew up very much in part of the culture of the place. He lived in adobes, traditional adobes. He did ranching. So he learned how to drive on his grandfather's ranch because his grandfathers put him in a truck and said, learn, because there wasn't anything to run into out there. So this is where he began, but he very quickly realized, unlike his great-grandfather, he was not interested in politics, and his father was also a politician. He was interested in architecture. It was sort of just there, innate almost. When he was still a child, he was busily building stuff. I think a lot of children do, but he kept on building things, and his parents got used to the fact that they would find odd constructions growing in the garage, and we'd just be assembling stuff. He discovered Frank Lloyd Wright in middle school and started studying him. When he was in high school, he took his first drafting courses. By the age of 17, he was designing houses for a local contractor, and this is one of his projects. So this is when you're in high school, age of 17, 1964. And I put them together because it suggests a number of things. One is that he grew up in New Mexico, and perhaps because he grew up in New Mexico, he didn't have to prove he was New Mexican, so he was not really ever very interested in building ye old traditional adobes. He said the rooms were small and dark and uncomfortable, and they were full of bugs. And he was much more interested in modern architecture. Now here he's just a high school student, but he's exploring his approach to modern architecture. That took him to Arizona State University, a 5-year program like OU. He was there from 1965 to 1970. He went to Arizona because the University of New Mexico did not have an accredited program at the time. He would have stayed in New Mexico, but the nearest he could find, it was still on the southwest, was Arizona. So he went there. While he was there, the most prominent member of the faculty was Calvin Straub, who's an important California modernist involved in the case study house. I don't know if you know the case study houses. These were modernist prototype houses. This is the one designed by Calvin Straub, the number 20, the Bass House from 1958. And in effect, you can see that this would be much more interesting to Bart than this was, because this allowed him to take what he'd been teaching himself and add a more professional element to it. And Straub was a quite accomplished architect. But it wasn't really where Bart was headed, this kind of very classic, clean, minimalist modernism. To illustrate that, I show you this project by Bart from 1968. It is a housing project that is across the freeway. It would be like a great bridge structure that was built across it. And I hope it speaks for itself. Obviously, whatever he's looking at, he was not looking at Calvin Straub when he was designing this. I think he's probably looking at people like Paolo Soleri, because there's a kind of Solerian megastructure quality to it. Already he'd pushed beyond the limits of just sort of mainstream orthodox modernism. Already his understanding of structure, form, and space had become more experimental and more radical. Now, given his interest and his proclivities and where he was headed, you'd think he would have gone to Wright's school, which is right there, Taliesin West. And I once asked him next door in Scottsdale, Bart, why didn't you go to Taliesin? And when I asked Bart this, he said, well, Frank Lloyd Wright is dead, and it didn't seem any point in going. If he'd been alive, he might have thought about it, but Frank Lloyd Wright died in 1959, a few years before he went to school. He immediately went on to point out that, however, he did have, in one of the attractions of Arizona, there was a lot of Frank Lloyd Wright architecture lying around. And that was just as good as the person himself, because he could go and study all of Frank Lloyd Wright's buildings. Here we have, we're looking down here at Taliesin West. He's climbed up. These are Bart's slides from 1969. This is his Plymouth Valiant with the boomer house in the background. He was caught by the connection between the roof profile and the side window of his car at that time. And so he was busily, spent a lot of his time out there just going and studying Wright's architecture. And he liked to quote Wright, saying, when a man builds, then you have him. And so he didn't need Frank Lloyd Wright in person, because Frank Lloyd Wright was there in his buildings. And then in 1968, Bruce Goff came to give a guest lecture at ASU. Now, like many people, Bart, even given his interest, didn't know anything about Goff. Who's this? So he was just curious, went to the lecture, and he was blown away. He was absolutely astounded. He'd never seen a living person who could design the way Goff did. And it was suddenly like something clicked in his head. Here was the person he was looking for. He was searching, 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 and here was that person. And it was nicely, conveniently for Bart, reciprocated. After the talk, they were showing Goff around the school, and they had students' works up on the wall, and conveniently enough, and I don't think this is an exaggeration, I think it's actually true, Goff stopped at Bart's work and said, I want to see the young man who designed this. And so Bart got to meet Goff, and Goff, being a great talker, they ended up talking all night. And by the end of that, Bart was convinced. And so immediately, it's a 5-year program, but he'd gone through it so quickly, he basically finished all of his coursework in 4 years. So he was a free man, and he started interning for Goff. Went down that summer and kept on interning. Came back occasionally to finish up his graduation requirements. But basically, from that point onward, he went into the second phase of his education, which was studying with Bruce Goff. After he graduated in 1970, he went to work with Goff, and he continued to partner with him for the next 22 years until Goff's death in 1982. Bart opened his own office in 1973 and became a licensed architect in the state of New Mexico in the following year. Bruce Goff became Bart's mentor. And he did it for, again, one of these things that's deceptively simple. It's easy to say, it's harder to do, and that is Goff simply encouraged Bart to solve design problems in imaginative ways that weren't afraid to buck convention, and Goff wasn't going to tell him how to solve those problems. He was interested in how Bart was going to solve that. And he never met somebody who was actually willing to let him figure out how to solve it. He was used to people saying, well, this is how you're supposed to do it. Now I'm showing you the Bavinger house, the late lamented Bavinger house, with one of Herb Greene's beautiful delineations of it on the left. And I'm using it merely as, well, probably get myself into trouble given the experts in the audience here, but as a way of quickly to kind of summarize the things that Bart learned from Goff. Because in a sense, for me, the Bavinger House is certainly one of the 10 most important buildings of the 20th century. It is absolutely extraordinarily brilliant work of architecture. And it's exactly the kind of thing that an imaginative architect like Bart would see and never look back again. What matters for today is if I say that it's shaped by a non-orthogonal geometry, a logarithmic spiral, that simply climbs out of the site. It was in a ravine, and it sort of emerges out of the ravine and just goes continuously until it reaches the sky. Built with local stone, quarried from the site, that is then filled in here and there with chunks of glass cullet. And again, simple, but quite brilliant, because what you've done is put together opposites: glass cullet, industrial slag, and then local quarried stone. So the near and the far, the sort of both extremes of what the world was like at that time, brought together in these walls. And a roof suspended from a central steel mast by cable stays from a World War II biplane. Now, who would have thought a biplane would have been useful to hold up a roof? And all of this working together in a beautiful symphony of integrated structure. Now inside, we have, continuing that metaphor, the kind of this grounded form but also floating, the suspended ceiling. Inside there were these pods, entertainment and sleeping pods, that were suspended from the ceiling in that single continuous spiraling space. In here, for at least me, we see the real genius of Goff's design. Because by basing the design on a spiral, he built a house with a single wall. And again, what? But if you ask how many walls does it take to build a house, well, you got one here, you got one there, you got one there, you got one there, you got a whole bunch of walls. There is one wall here. And how often do you can stand, well, it's the same wall, but it's on either side of you. And you can get your mind around that, then you're starting to get your mind around that mental attitude that Bart found in Goff. To make a space out of one structural form, a single wall that encloses space as it turns inward on itself. Now the result is what Goff called the architecture of the continuous present, borrowing the phrase from the very famous American writer Gertrude Stein, who coined it to describe her own writing. She said, "I made almost 1,000 pages of the continuous present." And what she meant is when she was writing, she was always writing now. And all of her experience was brought to bear now, again and again and again. Now, Goff took that idea and he elaborated it into architecture, because it identifies an architecture where our sense of space and time start over and over again with each present moment. To put it another way, wherever you are in the house, you're in the center of the house. Any part of it is the center of the house. You aren't at the front or the back of the house. Whatever, front and back of the house lose their meanings in a place like this. You are always in it, and it is always around you. Right? And the experience of that is continuous. You don't go from here to here because they are related by a continuum. Works like the Ballinger House taught Bart three fundamental things, or really encouraged him in three fundamental ways. One, that it was very possible to use the most mundane, common materials in profoundly original ways. Architects, as humans, like to fetishize things. They think, well, it'll be a good design if I use a very fancy material. It can be, but you don't need Carrara marble to do good architecture. You can do it with glass cullet. Second, it taught him to make an architecture that was spatially continuous, in which there was not a pause from one room to another. This house is one room. And it taught him how to create an architecture of interior landscapes. We go inside this, and yet the weird thing about the inside, we're still outside. It's really no different. And you don't feel like you're hemmed in and enclosed. You have the whole breadth of a landscape inside the house. Okay. Now, of course, behind Goff stood the towering example of Frank Lloyd Wright. When Goff explained the Ballinger House as an example of continuous present, he made reference to Wright's Taliesin West, which I'm showing you in an aerial view and then two detailed views here. And he said that Wright's Taliesin West is also a work of the continuous present. And what he meant is this was a work that you could enter at any point, and wherever you went into it, it would unfold logically. That unlike a usual building, which has a front and a back and an inside, or a normal composition of beginning, a middle, and end, this began wherever you went into it. Now, of course, yes, technically that's the front door, but you can go in here, you can go in there. Everywhere you are, it orients you to where you want to use it, how you want to use it. So it begins over and over again. It unfolds from wherever you are in that continuum of space and time. Now, in the case of Wright, this created an architecture that was completely integrated with its site, merging exterior and interior in one single work of architecture. An integration of a building with a site that, in the case of this design, is reinforced by the pinwheeling triangular geometry. And here you get an important lesson. So we have two examples of the continuous architecture, one based on a logarithmic spiral, the other on a triangle. The particular geometry doesn't matter because it doesn't start with form. That's merely a tool that you're going to use. The pinwheeling triangular geometry and structural materials. Now in this case, the redwood boards and especially the desert masonry, as he calls it, in which he pulled up pieces of sandstone and put them in board-formed walls. But it created an architecture that resonated with the surrounding landscape. It resonated chromatically with it and was, in some sense, literally made from it. So it was almost like you gathered it up. And Wright talked about this almost as if it were a campsite with just a bunch of stones around a fireplace. Well, Bart has studied this work very carefully. Works like Taliesin taught Bart three things. First, good design is based on an open-ended system of geometry. It could really be anything. He said, give me a square. Square doesn't limit you. It's how you use it. It's the mental attitude. Second, good architecture is the direct expression of structural materials. And third, good architecture is the continuity of space that is integrated with its site. Now, in an interesting way, I don't have time to go into it, it parallels Goff, but there's some important differences here. Wright was much more interested in structure and expressing it than Goff was, for example. Wright's architecture tended to open itself up to landscapes. Goff's tended to internalize more. Now, these are subtle differences, but they're important differences. None of these are absolutes, but they're subtle differences that mattered to Bart. And actually, when I'm giving you these lines, these are how Bart has explained. I said, what did he see as the difference between them? But the most fundamental thing is here we have another example of the architecture of the continuous present, but you would never for a moment confuse it with the architecture of Goff, that what each architect does not look the same. So he learned from both architects, and he learned that he didn't have to copy either one. Now, behind Wright and Goff lies a tradition of American architecture that reaches all the way back at least to Thomas Jefferson in the 18th century. And I'm going to try and collapse a very complicated history into one work, which is Jefferson's Monticello in Charlottesville, Virginia. Now, if we look at the classical, neoclassical architecture of Monticello, you'd say, well, that has nothing in common with either Wright or Goff. But that means you're still stuck on form and style, and you don't look at it the right way. What matters for someone like Bart is that, very much like Wright and Goff, Jefferson had an ability to think for himself. And his residence at Monticello shows it in three ways. First, siting. Monticello, which means little mountain or hilltop, it is located on a hilltop, and it commands the surrounding landscape. You say, well, so what? Well, that's not how you built Virginia Tidewater mansions, which are down in the valleys below. And Jefferson said, well, I don't want to be in the valley below for two reasons. One, it's hot and muggy down there, and if you're up on the hilltop, you get breezes. And the second one is there's no view down there, and I get a view up here. So he broke a convention. Nobody had ever thought that they could build a plantation manor on a hilltop until Jefferson said, well, why not? It makes sense to me. Second was space. Monticello is designed both from the inside out and from the outside in. If we had more time, we'll point out its real model is Palladio, the Villa Rotonda. The Villa Rotonda is an absolutely centralized building, but Jefferson deflects it. So this is the entrance facade, this is the garden facade, and it's almost as you took Monticello and rammed it on one side and pushed the middle of the building halfway through. So it goes in, it steps into a recession when you're going into the building, and then it pushes out on the other side. Does that make sense? And what he's done is taken a purely centralized building and give it a longitudinal axis of movement. So when you're going into the building, you're already headed out of the building again. You don't get to, there's no center to his building because he is part of that larger spatial system. So the building extends out into the site, but not just by the building itself. It has these arms, these terraces that end in little pavilions. You can almost, they're sort of there and there. Reach out on the garden side. So it reaches out and embraces the hilltop. Before Wright built Taliesin, Shining Brow, and you don't build on the hill, you build it of the hill. That's effectively what Jefferson was already doing. His house is on this hill, but it embraces the hill on which it is located. And then the third issue might be a little surprising, but it's actually very important. I'll just call it practicality. Jefferson invented his own solution to practical problems whenever the rules of good design got in the way. I mean, yes, he's doing the Palladian building, yes, he's doing neoclassical, yes, there's proportion, yes, there's orders, all these rules, but he does things like that, which are little windows. Now, those are where there should be a metope and a triglyph, a metope and a Doric order system. And he's put windows there because what actually looks like to be on the garden facade a single story is 1, 2, 3 stories. And you need windows on all floors, and those are windows in the upstairs rooms. And he simply put them in. And again, maybe less extraordinary to us, but for people who knew the rules of design, you can't put windows in a metope. And he said, well, why not? I need them. Or these little latticework gazebos that he's tucked into the corners, which violate the purity of the form of the building, but they gave him nice places he could sit in the summer. Latticework, he's protected from prying eyes. He was a former president. People were poking around all the time. He could be out of doors where it was cooler, but people couldn't see him. And again, the practical took dominance over the purely formal. Or those terraces, because what's on the other side of those terraces are the kitchens, the stables, the workshops, and indeed originally down here, the slave quarters. This was a slave plantation. There were a lot of stuff going on. You don't want them far away, you want them right there because it meant there's a continuous circulation system that connected to the main house. So all that going in back and forth it took to maintain the lifestyle here was right there at hand, but it was effectively invisible from the garden. So you could see one building from different ways depending on how you're using it. Well, this is the start of the kind of thinking that is then extended by Wright and Goff and Bart. How badly am I behind time now? Okay. So with that, let me turn to Bart himself, and I'm going to start with his own residence and studio. I don't know if you can make out this aerial view. It's showing you the arrow points out to the house itself. We're looking at it from the street. It is on a large main street, a very heavily trafficked street. You can see it's 4 lanes wide. It's fairly busy and noisy. And then a smaller secondary street. The site itself is here, and you can see it's a kind of regular trapezoidal shape. This part of Albuquerque was first developed in the 1920s. It was a direct response to the automobile. It was outside of town, but the automobile made it newly accessible, and it was fully developed right after the Second World War. Fully developed with one exception. There was one empty lot, which was this one. And the reason why is this was a kind of leftover parcel. And it was not, if you look at the other parcels, the regularly dimensioned parcels, not the same size, and it didn't have the 2 sides that were not parallel. What I'm getting at, it was left undeveloped because no contractor or regular architect could figure out how to build something that made economic sense on this site because there wasn't enough area within the setbacks. And these are the setbacks. Can you read this drawing? So here's the lot, but here is the buildable area within it. And you could build maybe a 1.5 bedroom house or something like that. Well, that didn't make any sense to anybody. So until Bart came along, he said, well, that's not a problem. That's an interesting challenge. And the way he went about solving it was took 2 circles, a larger one and a smaller one, front and back. We're looking here at the front, so we're looking at it from this direction. Filled them up to the setback lines. Now notice by using the circle here, you aren't really aware where the setback lines are because he's also, what usually people do with setback lines is that becomes a wall and they simply extrude it. So most houses, you know where the setback lines are because there's walls there. He wants to maximize that, but he doesn't want to be just following that lot. So the circles round off the corners, a studio on the ground floor in the front, and then his living room and dining area in the back. From that then rise 4 smaller cylinders. You can see one of them there. They come up and then support a 3rd floor. There is a mezzanine floor right there, a 3rd floor, which are the living quarters. Well, by the time he was done, on this unbuildable site, he'd built the equivalent of a 3-bedroom, 2.5-bath house plus an architect's office in it. Because he said, well, that's not a limitation. Of course I can build as much as I need. What you have to do is just think about it differently, and you go vertically. He just built it up as a series of towers. The geometry of the circle. The larger forward cylinder, and here we're looking at the working drawings for the house, so we're looking at this cylinder right now. Here we're inside it, and we're looking at it from the outside. Exterior walls, poured in place concrete block with sonotube columns, from which then rise metal pipe that then joins to the metal pipe that forms the radial ceiling, separated by glazing of Exolite, acrylic panels. A lot of very simple but quite brilliant things are happening here. We start with the fact, so we've got a circle, and in that he's placed the cylinder. The cylinder itself is structure, it is also function. It's where he puts the mechanical systems or the staircases to get to the upper floors. So it's holding the building up, but it's also serving the needs of the building. But rather than putting that in the center of the circle, he puts it off center. And again, once you've done it, of course, why not? Because what it does, and you can get a sense of it here, it throws your perception of the room off. The room is expanding. If we're just in the center, then there would have been this thing in the way. But now what you have is this generous sweep of space around. So what is in fact not a huge space feels very large. And that sense of expansiveness, and here you can see he's learned from Goff very well. It's what the brilliance of the Bavinger house is at work here. That sense of expansiveness is also increased by having the roof not join the wall, but float above it, so that you have this great sense of release around the edge of it, so that the sky and the light is coming in. Now, it doesn't hurt that all of these beautiful poetic gestures directly serve the practical needs. This is an architect's office, so lighting. And this is a perfect lighting because it's uniform, distributed, coming from above. It's not shining in your eyes, so it works that way. That block wall with a berm behind it also shelters this office against the noise of the street. So when you're in there, and everybody's been there will know what I'm talking about, it is remarkably quiet. You would not realize there was a lot of traffic outside. It is peaceful, calm, and quiet. It is a perfect space in which to work. Now, if we're to take, there's a staircase, these two at either end of the staircases are there, take a staircase up to the top floor of the house, running along, and that's this plan. And you're probably in the back, you'll just have to believe what I'm telling you, but a sort of elongated oval punctuated by those 4 cylinders. We're looking down the side. It faces to the south. Shading and tubes of water for solar gain. I was talking with Art at lunch today. Sustainability has become big, but it's a very ancient kind of thing. It's almost just common sense. Where is the sun? What is the sun doing? When do you want shade? When do you want to get sunlight? How do you want to use it to warm a space? Bart wasn't trying to make a big sort of chest-thumping gesture. He just wanted a comfortable space, and paying attention to the climate matters. Runs down, off of which are a series of rooms, private living rooms, bedrooms, and things like that on the other side. And so what we have is a continuum of space. You go in, you go up the staircase, the spiral staircase, you go down this hall, and there's these rooms off of it, but notice there's not walls separating one room from another. So it's almost, the analogy is more like a pool. There's a river, a stream going along, and then it eddies in a pool, where you feel enclosed, but never trapped, because little gestures like that, having the roof on the backside peel away to rise up and bring light from a clerestory, hidden clerestory, so it comes down, so that you're now surrounded by light as you're enclosed at the same time. One condition doesn't have to contradict the other condition. And you can see how here he's really working through what he's learned from Bruce Goff. Now there's another aspect, again self-evident, but I'll point it out. And that is the Bart Prince residence and studio is where he lives, but also where he works. In other words, he does not go to work, he lives at work. And he does not go home from work because he lives at work. Those are different categories that simply don't apply to him. He likes it if he gets an idea in the middle of the night, he just tumbles out of bed and goes down to his office and starts drawing something. He doesn't have to get in a car and go anywhere. Now, of course, there's an august tradition, and I just give you the example of Frank Lloyd Wright. The Oak Park Home and Studio, we're looking at the office wing. This is Taliesin, this is the studio wing, Taliesin East, and this is Taliesin West, and there was Frank Lloyd Wright's office. Wright always integrated those things because he, very much like Bart, and thought that they were not separate parts of life, but one continuous experience of life. You don't divide, this isn't your job, and then this is your life. Your life is what you do. It is your work. And so therefore, the studio is a natural part of the architecture of his house. It doesn't look like something that's separate. Its very expression shows you how integrated it is in his life. Now, just like his life and his work, Bart's residence and studio is therefore an open-ended project. Just as design starts all over again every time he gets a new client and a new project, so he treats his own residence and studio as something that is open-ended. And I have to emphasize this because one good way to annoy him is to confuse what he does with an architect like Frank Gehry. And he will look like he's sucked on a sour lemon and says, no, I don't do sculptural objects, I do spaces. And the point is, they look at Bart's work and it looks so sculptural that they think, oh, you can't possibly add onto it. And Bart delights in adding on to the things that you can't add on to because he doesn't think about it that way. That includes, for example, this, which is his library tower, which was added in 1990. So it's right there in this view. He built the house, and keep in mind we have this very compact site, but he's also an avid book collector. He has probably one of the best libraries of organic architecture, and anybody involved with that in the United States. It's absolutely astounding. So he wanted a tower. He also wanted that tower to be fireproof because a library takes a long time to collect. It's hard to say. You can burn a house down and rebuild it, but if you burn your library down, it's almost impossible to rebuild again. So he wanted something that he could add to it that it actually has 1, 2, 3 floors on it, so enough space for all of his books that was fireproof. And it fit with what was existing there. And the solution was very simple. Concrete block, which he has grouted solid. In other words, he's treated the concrete block like formwork, so he doesn't add formwork. He builds the walls and fills it in with concrete and rebar, so it becomes one solid cast concrete structure when he's done. It is fireproof, but each course of masonry, the circumference diminishes just enough. So what very simply it does, it nicely steps back from the house. As the house rises up and spreads out, the tower steps back. So each floor is smaller. And again, it's a wonderfully simple solution, but it is the perfect solution to it, because now it looks like it's always been there. It's solving its practical problems. It doesn't stick out like a sore thumb. And then in 2006, he added next door this gallery. He is also an avid collector of art, both New Mexico modernist paintings and also Bruce Goff, Lloyd Wright, Frank Lloyd Wright. He has an enviable collection of drawings as well. And he wanted a gallery space to exhibit. And what is a gallery space? Well, it is long walls with, again, the right kind of lighting. And ideally, the right kind of lighting will come up from above, which meant that he wanted a long rectangular object, which then pops up. So long walls along that. You can see it right there. And so there's two walls, plenty of walls to exhibit his stuff, which then pops up with a series of skylights to bring in the light and diffuse it and diffract it from up above. It produces, on one hand, oh, you say, well, he's imitating himself. He's got another long object, although I point out the geometry of this is completely different than the geometry of that, because he's solving a different problem. Now, in this case, once you deal with the program, the other thing is he owned the lot next door. There is this 1940s adobe house, which he had carefully restored on the inside. He wouldn't build one for himself, but it was nice there. It was a nice one. Adobe is earth, right? It's okay structurally, but it's not, you can't build on top of it. So he had to figure out how to build a gallery over the existing adobe house without having to put columns down through the house without infecting it. And what that meant is that suddenly his gallery became a bridge that is supported. Here are the main supporting beams, and at the front and back are these tripods, two sets of triangular angled columns that come together like legs, one holding one beam, the other one that. And so from there to there, it simply spans the existing house. And then the only other constraint he had is how to fit it on the site, because if he built this straight, he would run into the setback line problem, so it's set diagonally on the site. And all I want to suggest here is how, when you think about with that mental attitude, that problem-solving attitude, you end up with something that looks like you've never seen it before, and yet every step is perfectly logical. It makes perfect practical sense. What are the practical problems I'm solving? As long as you don't have a preconception. Well, it's got to look like this. No, it looks like this because this is how the space had to work with the structure on that site. Okay. Oops. So now I want to look at two houses of Bart working not for himself as his client, but for two actual clients. I want to look first at the Price House in California, which you see here, and then the Whitmore residence in New Mexico, to show how architecture responds to both the natural and cultural conditions of its place. The Price House is in Corona del Mar, which, if you know California, is about 50 miles south of downtown LA. The site is located directly on the Pacific coast. Now, I haven't pointed out to you, you have to look for a while to figure where out the house, because it fits into its site. It's here. And in this aerial view, it is there. And the first point I want to say is that it blends into its site. It blends into its site much more clearly than the neighboring houses. This house doesn't even exist. It's been torn down and been replaced by a McMansion now. So this actually looks better than what replaced it. But the point is, this is a large house, and yet the first thing it does is try to disappear into its site. And we'll see a lot of the logic of this house is what happens when you build directly on the Pacific Ocean. We get a house that is almost just like an extrusion of the cliff on which it sits. But when we're talking about the Price House, we aren't talking about any normal client, because the Price House is a very layered cultural portrait of its owners, Joe and Etsuko Price. And there are two sides to this. One is the price side, because this is the same Joe Price everybody here, I assume, knows very well. The client who commissioned the house from Bart is the same Joe Price who earlier commissioned Bruce Goff to design his house in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, also now sadly lost to an arsonist. Shinnencon, built in phases between 1956 and 1976. And you saw earlier Bart taking a picture of Goff at one phase when he was working for Goff that summer. And this is the same Joe Price, whose father, Harold Price, commissioned Frank Lloyd Wright in 1952 to design the Price Tower, also in Bartlesville. In other words, when Bart got Joe Price as a client, he was getting a whole lineage. He was getting the client of Bruce Goff, whose father had been the client of Frank Lloyd Wright, and so suddenly Bart was put in the third generation of a way of thinking about architecture. Bart was very aware of this, and of course Joe Price got to know Bart very well when they were building the LA Pavilion for Japanese art, the second Shinnencon, because Bart really carried out the construction of that building. Goff died before it got beyond diagrams and for a place in Bartlesville. So moved to California. Joe Price moved to California, needed a new house, and he logically turned to Bart as his architect. Bart was aware of this, but he was also the kind of architect who wouldn't be afraid. Oh, well, I've got to do something. How do I do this? How do I make it look? Well, he knew better than to worry about that. That was the wrong question to ask. He knew he was adding to an important heritage. Now, I'm putting together the three works. I'll let them speak for themselves. It is kind of odd, after the more these things you see, the more they seem to belong together without being confused with each other. You're still not going to confuse, or I wouldn't at least, Frank Lloyd Wright with Bruce Goff with Bart Prince, and yet there is a kind of family here. There is a mental attitude that is at work. That's one piece of the story. But an equally important part of the story is that Joe Price is married to a Japanese woman, a native Japanese woman, Etsuko. This is because, among other things, Joe Price is one of the most important collectors of Japanese art in the United States. And the whole reason why he commissioned the Shinnencon was a place to house part of his collection. He's had a long-standing interest in Japanese art. So Bart knew that when he was responding to Joe Price as his client, he also knew that he was responding very much to Etsuko, who has a mind of her own, and that he was also responding to two different cultural contexts. One was of an American tradition of architecture, but also was how that merged and bridged the Pacific Ocean to connect with Japan. I'm going to start by suggesting, here we're looking at an aerial view. This is the house, pointing to. There's a closer in aerial view. So this is the street approach, which is down there. The street facade, and you're just going to have to believe me, I'm sorry for this. We're looking at the street elevation of the house here. This is the side that actually goes down there. And I'm comparing it to something called a macha. Macha, there are a lot of different Japanese house types, but the one that matters here is the macha, which is a pre-modern Edo period and before urban townhouse. And it was essentially middle-class housing. Aristocrats lived in a different kind of house, but this was on the streets of Tokyo or Kyoto. You would have found them lined by these. And they were characterized by facades that tended to come down very low. Essentially one story, the little sort of attic story above it, very low. Behind that, and you'll have to believe me, they then go back. They're very deep. They were sort of low and narrow in front, but they go back very deep, and they'd have gardens and so on behind them. And again, sorry if you could see this, the way Bart has treated the roof, it pulls down over the house, so it actually conceals the size of the interior spaces. So it pulls down, and what you get in the front there is the garage. And it's very sort of quiet and inobtrusive. It does not rise up monumentally. It pulls down. And what that does is shelter behind that two parts to the house. There's this part that wraps around, And then there are these 3 pods, and I'm going to talk more about these 3 pods in a moment. These traditional Japanese houses were organized spatially into 2 parts. The front part of the building, which we're looking at here, was the more public part. It would address the street, and is where these were for merchants or craftsmen. It was usually where the shop would be. So it was a point you could go from the street into, but you'd only go through the front part. Behind that, there was a very distinct division between the rest of the house, which was private. And given the gendered roles, the front public part was the male zone, the back part was the female zone. The actual house itself belonged to the woman. But they were always organized in those 2 parts. And Bart has taken not only the gesture of having this house pull itself down on the street, but organized it into these 2 parts, because this is, from the garage, it wraps around. These are the private domestic spaces of the house, and these are Joe Price's offices and quarters. And so when you go there, when you went there most of the time, you would not be invited into here. You went into here. You went into the public zone. And Joe Price was very clear about that and said, I don't go into the other part without Etsuko's permission. That's her part of the house. Now, I'm making this point because, of course, it doesn't mean that what Bart is doing looks like a Japanese pre-modern townhouse. It doesn't look like a matcha at all. But it has a spatial logic that resonates with that. This is how the mental attitude works. And that that attitude is very important because he has to answer 2 clients who are very well aware of these social traditions and how you divide a house spatially. Now, Joe's part in this plan is this section right here, and we were looking at in sections. So here there are 3 pods. You can see them under 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. We're looking at them on the other way. And here we're inside of them. We're actually standing in this pod looking back to that pod. Does this make sense? You following me here? Wonderful structure. What we have are glue laminated, and I've been trying to figure, should I call them beams? Shall I call them columns? Shall I call them ribs? It doesn't really matter because they're really one continuous structural form. The glue laminated element, let's say here, it comes off, jumps across, and then comes back down again to wrap around. A continuous structural form. So what starts in the center as a column then becomes columns, becomes ribs for the ceiling, and becomes columns for the sides. It is one continuous thing because he's not thinking about what particular structural form, he's thinking about how to create this space that is constantly wrapped around. Now, on the outside, you can get a sense that there are 3 separate volumes, but inside, of course, they merge with each other. Because we don't have walls, we simply use the structure, and the structure becomes the articulation of the space so that one pod flows into the next one. Now, there are a lot of things going on here. Here we're standing in the courtyard. So we're looking up at 2 of the pods. You can see the column that rises up, and then it comes around to embrace it, and then you simply sheathe it with standing seam copper above, and then tongue and groove boards below that, over this free-form swimming pool. Now, a lot of images are calling to mind here. Do not take my images literally. The wonderful thing about poetic architecture, just when you're writing poetry, you can bring your metaphors to it. The metaphors are perfectly legitimate, but don't say, well, that's what he was trying to illustrate, all right? But it opens up a place. So, in one hand, and keep in mind, when you're standing here, you hear the beach below, you hear the Pacific Ocean crashing on the score, you have the quality of light and air from being in the ocean, and here you are in this watery environment. And so it's just like he's just brought the Pacific Ocean right into the house. You've left it behind, and yet you've brought it with you at the same time. But in doing that, he's not only making a reference to the natural conditions of the place, but also continuing the cultural references that he has to make. This idea of a series of pavilions, because these pods are each a separate pavilion, that are associated with a body of water is very Japanese. If we aren't talking about townhouses, we are talking about the aristocratic residences that tended to be villas in gardens, the most famous of which is Katsurarikyu in Kyoto from the 17th century, in which around a pond were a series of tea pavilions. And we're actually in one of the pavilions looking across at another pavilion. And what Bart quite brilliantly has done here, again, without copying anything, without doing anything literally, but he's created the same effect, that you have the feeling that you are in one of these Japanese gardens with a series of pavilions that are dotted across this landscape. And it's not simply that idea, but what character, I don't know, you would have to, it's a little washed out up there, but Japanese architecture, particularly of these tea houses, the structure is all exposed. So you can see the structure of the roof there. You can see exactly how it's put together. And that aesthetic is carried through here, so that it is Japanese not only in the kind of siding, but it is also Japanese in the sensibility of a wooden material that is open and directly expressed, even as it is transformed and updated for new building technologies and new materials that weren't available in the 17th century. Now here again, he did what he did for his own house. After he built the house for Joe Price, and Joe did the Shinnin-kan, but he still had part of his own collection. And he needed a space. He had exhibited his work in his original Shinnin-kan in Bartlesville, and he wanted a space. So he commissioned Bart to do a phase 2 in 94 to 96 to add a gallery and storage place, a place to store and to exhibit his works of Japanese art. Nicely enough, that commission was twinned with, at the same time, Joe Price asked the very famous Japanese architect Kisho Kurokawa to design a traditional Japanese tea room that would be off of the gallery. So Bart had to incorporate that. And if you think I'm making up all the Japanese stuff, I hope this silences you, because you can't get more Japanese than Kisho Kurokawa designing your tea room in your house. Bart's doing, however, another addition. Now you'll notice right away he's gone from the language of wood that characterized the original house. Now we have cast-in-place concrete. First of all, practical considerations. This is a gallery. It has to be a fireproof vault. Wood has a tendency to burn, so therefore Bart knew that he had to switch materials. He had to go from wood to concrete. He had to make it fit into the house. And what he did, and you can sort of see it discontinues right, the tea house is back there. It's almost like he sort of slid it underneath the wooden house. And since we're on a rocky outcropping with a series of Torii pines and things like that and all these boulders, what he's done is created an evocation of the site in which we have this wooden house that's grasped onto the masonry of the gallery like a boulder. So he's, again, converted the natural conditions of the site into an architectural expression. Concrete, however, is massive and heavy, and he doesn't want to do something that is massive and heavy. So he has to do something that is in fact heavy, but doesn't seem that way. And then when you go inside, doesn't feel constraining. And this will become more relevant in a moment, because it's for exhibiting Japanese art. And Japanese faces were not heavy, they were light, ephemeral ones. So he has to keep that quality. And he does it partly on the outside where the roof sort of slides past the supporting pylons, these little cantilevers like fingers reaching out into space. And this creates the effect that they're sort of floating free of gravity. Most beautifully, on the inside, the entire structure, and this is tricky, way beyond the engineering that I have, the entire structure balances on one single inclined column. It's stabilized along the front, but inside, that's it. This huge plane of concrete is resting on that one column. And if you see that, even if you know, well, obviously it's not what it looks like, but what it looks like, you can't help but think, well, it's floating. It's not resting. This column isn't holding anything up. It's actually trying to hold it down. You can see it pulling down. It reverses our whole expectation. And it's a beautiful kind of metaphor that it creates, that it convinces us that this massive structure is in fact weightless, that it is floating free. Here we're looking the other direction from the entrance to the tea house, back at a traditional display alcove called a tokonoma, in one of Joe Price's beautiful Edo period screens, multi-panel screens. Note how Bart has taken the idea of shoji. We're inside one of the pavilions at Katsura Rikyo here. The traditional shoji, the rice paper, create this beautiful, warm, kind of translucent light. Bart's picked up on that, although this is fireproof cowl wall in this case. Keep in mind this is a gallery space. He changes the geometry, so he managed to evoke the quality of a Japanese traditional shoji screen without actually copying it. What's driving all of this, and this was very, very important to Joe Price, Japanese works of art are not meant to be seen under bright illumination. They were seen in interiors, and you can get a sense of it here. They're kind of shadowy, a little dark. You have to sort of go into the darkness. You have to sit there a while to see what you're looking at. It doesn't immediately pop out. We like to put a spotlight on it. We got to look at it. The Western kind of clinical view. That's not Japanese. And the whole idea of a gold background, if you're going to show it a bright light on it, it's just garish. But if it's in this shadowy, it's a beautiful thing, and it sort of emerges out of the shadows. And so Bart was very aware that he had to, in this gallery, create the kind of quality of light that you would have found in a 17th century Japanese space, the kind of space for which the works of art were themselves originally created. So the more we go, the more we find these references to Japanese without it ever actually being Japanese. And I remind you, it's not a light wooden structure, it is a massive concrete one. Now, to the degree we're dealing with concrete, Bart can't help but be aware that the great master in the American tradition was Frank Lloyd Wright. He's one of the first to really systematically take on the problem of concrete. It's partly a question of geometry, but it's also a question of space. How do you let the space come through such a massive structure? I'm showing you Unity Temple here. And you do it by, of course, as the structure goes up from the walls, it starts dissolving visually in the columns, piers that are supporting it, and then you have these cantilevers so that this kind of liberation. You avoid constraining corners so it doesn't box in. All those little devices that Wright's written about so extensively, all of that's in Bart's mind. He has to understand, he has to solve that same problem. He's not designing Unity Temple, he's designing Joe Price's galleries. He can't solve it the same way, but it is a problem that's been around before. And so we see, what is the point of a gesture like that? Of course, it makes the whole thing start to float and levitate, equivalent to that. And at the same time, there is one exception in Japanese architecture is of wood, except for the structure of castles. Castle walls in Japan, and we're looking at probably the most famous, Himeji, where these great pieces, piles up of polygonal masonry that had these typically battered profiles. And suddenly and again, it's just on your peripheral vision. Don't take me literally. Don't tell Bart I said this. I'll get into trouble. But it's there because he's also trying to give to this a Japanese inflection. This is, after all, a gallery of Japanese art. Here we're just looking straight on. The Pacific Ocean sort of faces out to the Pacific Ocean. This gallery is wonderfully suspended. It's suspended between the earth and the sky, between the coast and the water. It seems to be floating at the same time it's grounded. It seems to be in the United States at the same time it seems to be in Japan. But the more that you think about this, the more that you sit there and look at the works of art, you realize you literally are between two worlds, and that was the project problem that he was being given by Joe and Itsuko Price. All right, how's your endurance holding up? Okay? I'm not beating you all to death with too much stuff. All right, this is the last one, I promise. I want to go from California to New Mexico. Interestingly enough, Bart's done a lot of work in California. Californians like him more than he likes Californians. He finds them a little annoying because he's very much a Southwestern architect, so California is kind of a different world for him. He's happiest when he's just working in New Mexico. The Whitmore residence What you're looking at here was built in 2002-2003, a place called Glorieta, which is a little bit north of Santa Fe. I'm going to talk more about Glorieta in a moment. It was built for a psychologist who closed her practice and sold her house in Santa Fe to retire in this valley of red sandstone and green pinon trees. Jane Whitmore, who actually has an interest in Japan as well, she speaks Japanese, so you keep running into these things when you least expect them. She asked for a lot of things, but there were two primary things she asked Bart to consider. One, she wanted a house that worked with the site. She started with the site, it's what she loved about it, and she wanted a house that when she was done, she felt like the site was still there, the complete site, that it hadn't lost anything. And she wanted a house that was responsive to the climate. Now, in New Mexico, that means two particular things, and New Mexicans have known this since the day of the Chacoans. Sun, we have a very strong sun. We're at high elevation. This is about 7,000 feet, so it'll blister you pretty quickly. It's a strong sun. But there's also, because it's high elevation, cold winters, and particularly when the winds come through from the west. She wanted a house that worked with the sun, but also a house that was comfortable in the winter and protected the house against the winter winds which come from the west. South is here, north is there, west is that direction, and east is over there. So what you got was a house that opens to the southeast with a courtyard, while closing itself off to the west with great walls. I'm not going to bring in Chaco Canyon, but if you don't know what it looks like, go look at them. They all tend to have these great walls at the back, and then they open with courtyards. He's doing an idea that's been around a long time. You don't copy Chaco, you just recognize the logic of the climate in the place that you're building. So he creates something that has great walls on one side, then opens up with this sun court in the other direction. And out of that, he gets a house that is two colliding triangular wedges, a shorter and narrower one, and then a larger one. And the collision between them helps to create this courtyard. Two wedges of space. The wedges themselves are framed by walls of concrete block, covered in some places here with stucco, but they are, as you can see, concrete block. And between them, you have this glass pavilion. You'll see this more clearly in a moment. The concrete block uses a red volcanic scoria. It's the native kind of scoria of New Mexico. And it gives to this, I don't know if you can see it from this, but it gives to the concrete block a kind of pinkish tinge. It's almost like the red sandstone of the place is sort of leaked into or washed across the concrete. So it starts bringing up the tonalities. And the stucco itself, it's actually now called Bart Prince. He invented the green itself, but he invented it because it was the green of sages. So it naturally harmonizes. And so what he's done is the reds and the greens of the landscape have become the reds and the greens of the house, but sufficiently different that you know one and the other, but they are clearly speaking and communicating with each other. And combined with the wedges, the first image I had is like he's simply taken the site and pulled it and piled it up into this house. He's simply taken pieces of the site and arranged it quickly, almost as Wright seems to have done with Taliesin West, as a place that you could camp out in this canyon. All right, here we see it in plan. So this is the courtyard. There is one wedge. There is the other wedge. In between is the glass pavilion. We'll get to that in a moment. In these two views, we're actually looking in this section. And what we have is they are parallel walls that form circulation corridors that have between them these interior spaces. And they can be, as you see right here, a little pocket garden. So that you go into the house, and as you can see here, you can't see the surrounding landscape, and yet you're still out in the landscape. This is both a very Goffian idea, it's also a very Japanese idea. They're called tsuboniwas, these little pocket gardens that you'd find in traditional Japanese houses. And here the metaphors start building on themselves more, because it's almost like we're going down a series of canyons or ravines or ridges with larger valleys in between, as if he's simply taken the logic of the landscape, the ridges and the canyons around it, and brought it into the architecture of the house. And at the center of all of this is this glass pavilion. Now this is a little misleading, because this is actually the floor print. It's not the roof structure up above, because it extends outward. But above it is this very thin wooden roof held up on a steel frame. You can see that triangular sort of tripod kind of thing, the same thing he'd used on his own gallery and studio. Floating free and surrounded by glass, you simply look right through the house. If you want to extend the metaphors, it's as if there's some, let's say, these two wedges collide with each other and they exploded into fragments that went into space. But Bart has something more serious going on here, because what he's doing is setting up a kind of observation platform. Remind you that Jane wanted Bart to have a house that was about the place, the site. And so while the bedroom wings, you go inside and you return, the main spaces we have here is the living room area, the dining room area, the living room area there, the dining room area, the kitchen area. The main spaces of the house are literally right out there in the landscape. And everywhere you look, you are in that landscape, protected from it, but otherwise out in it. So you will never pull yourself apart from that site. You're always constantly being returned, and it is meant to throw your view back out. Now, partly a little maliciousness on my part, but if we're talking about a glass pavilion that is about looking at nature, perhaps the most famous example of that is Mies van der Rohe's Farnsworth House in Plano, Illinois, which I show on the right, a work of 1945 to 1951. Put this in context, this is when Goff was working, and how can two architects be working in the same continent in such different ways at the same time, and yet they were. Now, there are things in common. Both are using industrial materials, steel and glass, concrete, and both are creating, in effect, glass houses, because it is about throwing you back out and putting you in the midst of landscape, so you go inside and then you can sit and look back out. But these similarities, I think, merely highlight their differences. The Farnsworth House is, as we would expect from Mies, a very crisp and clean and minimal and pure geometric volume, measured off by regularly spaced columns. And the order is so much that even when we get a fragment of it, we can complete it in our mind. We know what those intervals are, and they aren't going to be changing, because he is thinking in classical terms. The Whitmore residence, as I've already said, is instead assembled from colliding triangular geometries. It's not going to resolve itself into one repeating increment. The Farnsworth House, it's afraid of chiggers or something. We were talking about chiggers yesterday. This thing is not going to touch the ground. It's raised up above it. It floats at a nice distance from its site. Bart's is emphatically set down on the ground. It is grounded. Farnsworth House, the steel frame is painted white. We want no confusion with the surrounding green of that site. We want to know very clearly what the language of an industrial classicism is, and we don't want to confuse it with nature, whereas Bart, as I've already pointed out, is working very hard to use those materials in a way that actually resonate and pick up with the colors of the site. In other words, the Farnsworth House pulls back from its site. It sets architecture apart from nature as an abstract and ideal form. We climb up to that better level and we look back on nature and we understand beyond the accidents the underlying Platonic order of things. Whereas the Whitmore residence reaches out to embrace the site as a place where you are integrated with the site. You can't step back from the site here. You are in the site. You understand the site not intellectually, but by your experience of being there. And these different approaches to putting architecture and nature together, I think, reflect different cultural attitudes. The Farnsworth House, Mies van der Rohe, after all, was a German architect. emigrated to the United States in the 1930s when things got too dicey for his career in Germany. So he approached the American landscape as a European architect, and you can sense the kind of, it's a beautiful work, but there's a kind of alienation. He's not quite sure how to put his work down on the ground here, because it's not a ground he really knows. He's still feeling his way, worrying about the chiggers that are on the site. Bart doesn't have any of those constraints. His is about that place, and he sits down there and says, this is where I belong. And we're really almost there. Because if we understand how grounded it is, we have to understand something else about this house. It's one of the weird things about New Mexico. It's in the middle of nowhere. There's an awful lot of nowhere out there. And yet, it is a nowhere that is full of stuff, because people have been living there longer than any other part of North America. And so you have to start rethinking what you're seeing, because very often what looks to be in the middle of nowhere turns out to be in the middle of somewhere very important. And that's the case of Glorieta. Glorieta Pass is an important crossroads in the history of New Mexico. It's located in a mountain pass that leads north from New Mexico to Colorado. It was the major route for Americans who were moving into the area, both before and during the period when New Mexico was made a U.S. territory in 1848. How they got into New Mexico, if you were a U.S. citizen, was from Colorado. And how you got into New Mexico was going through Glorieta Pass. So this place that looks like nowhere was the 18th century version of the interstate, in other words. People constantly coming and going. That probably explains why the most important event of the Civil War for New Mexico took place here, just down the road from Jane Whitmore's house at where that bridge is. That's Bart on the bridge. This old remain. I don't think this is the original Civil War bridge, but it replaced the Civil War bridge, and it's not much younger than that, the Civil War bridge. The Battle of Glorieta, fought between the Union and Confederate forces on March 27th and 28th, 1862. It is known as the Gettysburg of the West, because it ended the Confederate attempt to occupy New Mexico. And that battle took place here. And given all of this, the third thing, and the one that mattered most to Bart, is when the railroad finally entered New Mexico in 1879 to 1880, although in this part 1879, the railroad came through Glorieta Pass, and it is to this day where the railroad runs. And so what I've done here in this panoramic perspective, it's about 220 degrees, but there is the track. There is the Amtrak coming through every day, Los Angeles to Chicago and back. Once a day, it'll pass there either direction. As it happens, it's climbing uphill when it goes going to Chicago, so it slows down, and everybody crowds over because they say, what's that thing down there? Because there's this strange house. Bart saw it from the other perspective. He loves trains. It says, if you think of a train, it's like a building, except it's moving sideways, right? But it's the same mass at a building, except it moves. Why not? So there's this building that moves by his building. And he really conceived of, and that's really the point that you see here. You see the train up there? That every day, Jane Whitmore could watch the train, or twice a day, Jane Whitmore could watch the train go by. And the house was set up for that. Now you'd think, well, wait a second, I thought this was all about going back to nature, but it's not an either or, it's both. Part of the nature of this place is the history of the culture of this place, and part of that is the railroad. And so Bart is going to celebrate the railroad as much as he celebrates the rocks and the trees and the sky and the sun of this place. Those are all become part of the character of this house. And this is my final slide. So let me suggest in the end that if Bart's glass house is really not like the Farnsworth house, it's really much more like the little cabin that Henry David Thoreau built for himself at Walden Pond outside Concord, Massachusetts in 1845. This is a view of it from the book that Thoreau wrote. He lived there for 2 years. This was his famous experiment in transcendental living, returning to nature, and he wrote a book called Walden about it. published in 1854. Now, if you've read Walden, you know the story is a little more complicated than we think of it. It's a returning to nature. Walden, he's out in his pond. If you know where Walden is, basically Concord, Massachusetts. And if you were living in mid-19th century America, Concord, Massachusetts was the center of stuff. It was where all those transcendentalists were hanging out. And the reason why, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, you name it, why they were all living there is because the other thing is New England and Massachusetts, which was the center of the Industrial Revolution in the United States, that intellectuals need money, and the money was coming from the Industrial Revolution. And what Henry David Thoreau was really writing about in Walden was not returning to nature, it was figuring out how do we keep hold of nature in a changing world. The railroad ran right past Walden Pond, and he writes about it in Walden Pond. He writes about the railroad embankment and how it changes through the seasons of the year. He has integrated into his experience of the world. And that, I would suggest, is really the American experience. We have an extraordinary landscape, but it is never just the wilderness. It is always wilderness with us in it. And the moment you put us in it, of course, it's no longer just nature, it is also culture. And it is about the relationship between those two. And so Bart intuited that's really what was motivating Jane in choosing this site, and he made her house a celebration of that essential American condition. Thank you. Beating everybody into submission. They need a restroom break and a drink break and a...
I have one question.
Okay.
Well, I have many, but I'm going to limit myself to one. So you highlighted how Bart Prince tries to respond to his clients, and I've heard other American school architects talk about the process of working with a client as maybe like asking them about their favorite music, their favorite color, and I'm wondering if you know anything about the process that Bart uses to work with his clients, the types of questions he asks, or what kinds of meetings he organizes, or how he likes to spend time with them and learn about them.
As if they're an easy answer. He engages in fairly long conversations with his clients and talks with them, and it happens. I mean, I'm one of Bart's clients. We started talking about my house. I was over in Paris finishing research on a book on French architecture, and the first edition of the first book I wrote about him came out, so he traveled, just did a surprise trip over and said, I'm going to come over and bring you the book. So we spent a week together in Paris trooping around, looking at a lot of Hector Guimard, Art Nouveau architects, Le Corbusier also, but he was most interested in Guimard. And while we're there, we started talking about whether they do a house for me. Now, I think that was a little more extended because not every client writes a book about him. But it's true, he's interested in three things. First, are you coming to him for the right reason? In other words, are you coming to him to design something, or because you think you know what he will design or you want it to look like something? And he will usually try to, architects of that, clients of that category, he will try to discourage them. Say, well, you know, I think you want to go talk to so-and-so. I think he's a better architect for you. It works best if you give him free rein on the design. But he is very concerned about the practical things. I mean, what do you want? The kind of rooms you want. I mean, the functional kind of rooms, not spaces in the box kind of things. But he's also very interested in what kind of budget you have. So I didn't have a Joe Price budget. Joe Price's house, you know, was $8 million. My house was $200,000, so he'll cross that spectrum. But that makes a difference, right? But also part of that is what's your site? So when I worked with him, I wrote a detailed program that laid out all the information he wanted, and it included not just practical things, but taking advantage of the climate, views and things like that, the things that I quoted Jane Whitmore. He meditated over that, but it didn't become real for him until we actually bought a lot. Because he had no idea how he was going to solve the program until he knew the site. And it's not that one comes before the other, but the moment I bought the site and had the site survey and sent over, he was over, I was like that, with a very tall ladder, and we climbed up in the middle of the site to look around. And that's when he started designing it in his head. I don't know how whether he designs in his head. So he doesn't start sketching. He thinks about it. He says, I can rotate it in my mind. I keep rotating and rotating until I'm ready. And then when we think of the design, he's actually recording. It's like musical notation. He is notating it. So I actually have the preliminary sketches done in 2 days for my house. And it was before the working drawings. It was done in 2 days. They're dated. And essentially, once he figured out the plan, which was a notation of the entire space, he's also thinking sectionally, so he also knows what it means in elevation. So the other drawings are simply confirming what's in the original site plan kind of thing, and bang, like that. But the site, that's when it became real. And that's when he had my program, he had the money, he had my budget, my non-budget, but he needed the site. And then I can't argue with him. How does he know what, otherwise it's an abstraction. He knows me, but where is the house going to go? The house is a real thing, so he needs a place. I don't know if that answers it, sort of. Okay. Up.
As a client, what was the most unique or original design solution that he came up with for you that you might not have expected?
Well, just about everything. I said, I'd already written a book about him. And I said, well, I got to get him to build a house for me so I really understand this guy. Because then, as his client, and I was also the builder of record, so that I actually had to sign all the checks, but kept track of it. And I was selfishly wanting, because I wanted to see the whole process from presenting the project, how we presented it. And he presented it with plans, ground floor, then the second floor, then the elevations, and then the model. The model came out last. And he only does models for clients. He only did it, my wife is a photographer, and she says, I'm not spatial. So she needed the model to understand. She looks at plans and her eyes glaze over. But the plans, and and we're talking about not labeling. The plans were not fully labeled. They were just sort of, and he walked us through them. So this is going to come in, you're going to go up here, you're going to go there, and this is going to happen. And then he didn't show me the whole thing at once. As they said, I look very disappointed because the downstairs of my house, which has the bedroom spaces, is more conventional. For Bart, it's more conventional, and the upstairs is where things really happen. He says, you brightened up considerably when you got upstairs in that project. So that's more like it. But he walks you through every step of the way. It was just seeing how, I remember, for example, at the back of my house is a trapezoidal concrete block library. Different geometry, but the same kind of problem as his own library. Concrete blocks are 90-degree angles, and they've laid out the foundations. I know that they aren't going to have any right angles with the corners of this thing, and so I was expecting a lot of cutting and sawing of concrete blocks, which wouldn't have fit my budget. One reason you get at $200 a square foot, you've simplified the labor, not just the materials, but the labor. And that's the way, it's an old technique. Frank Lloyd Wright understood how he knitted the corners so that each alternating courses follow the different alignments, so they start fretting with each other. And it was beautiful, and it was sort of revelation, because not only had he made a budgetary decision to save a lot of money, but it produced a beautiful detail that was simply the result of building the wall. He didn't have to add the detail, and yet there was this extraordinary detail. And he did that again and again and again. The ability to do one action that had 3 or 4 benefits built into it at the same time. Our dining room is also the garage. So he doesn't have to build a garage and a dining room. By building the dining room, he was building the garage. And there's constant these kind of overlapping kind of things. So it taught me a lot about architecture. It was really my sort of postgraduate education, watching that thing. Yeah.
You made a lot of comparisons his analysis of philosophy that he had in building these homes. And you made comparisons with other buildings. How much of that is of you, and how much of that is in consulting with Bart? Is this your analysis of his thoughts, or is this his thoughts?
It's probably a hopeless muddle by now because I've been listening to him and talking to him so long. But the honest answer is it's me. I was telling, I don't know who it was last night at dinner, one of the books I did with Bart, the very first book, a little slim little book, which he liked a lot. And he took it on a vacation one time to read it again, and he came back and reported he still liked it, a wonderful book. So I sort of said, well, what do you like about it? He says, well, I never would have thought about myself that way, but I like the way you think about me. And if you think about that, and he recognizes that he doesn't control the audience. I mean, that's the real courage of these architects. You don't have to tell people what to think. Bart's he knows what he's thinking, he knows how he's solving the problem, and then he's interested in what happens in response to it. So my house, everybody it's called the fish house, it's called the airplane house, it's called the submarine house. He wasn't thinking about any of those things, but that's what they bring to it. So it's part of, and that's a sign of the sort of poetic content that they would say to it. So he doesn't mind it. I mean, he wants me to have my facts straight. I mean, you do need to know what's actually going on in the structure and why these decisions have been made in terms of site. Meaning, that's probably, my reading on it. That's my job. I'm supposed to, I sort of interpret things.
It always bothers me when articles are written about a project that an architect has done and it maybe wasn't consistent with his initial thought, his concept, or an artist, a painting of an artist. And then their explanation of what it was about may be totally different from the artist itself. And it seems to me that it'd be important to have the context of that the artist or the architect and you are in agreement in the philosophy.
Yeah, and I mean, all the things I've written, I've always consulted with Bart. I mean, he's always read the manuscripts, so you always get a chance from feedback. I've never pulled anything behind his back. He's aware of what I'm doing, what I'm speaking. He may be watching this for all I know right now. So there's no secrets there, but there is mutual respect. In other words, I do deeply respect what he does, and I would never try to misrepresent it or betray it, but that also means being honest about what I'm doing. I am not Bart, and I can't pretend to be Bart or to speak about it the way he would. All I can do is say, this is how I respond to what he's doing. I hope I've been honest today, indicating where I'm sort of going off in the little sort of metaphorical clouds and so on and leaving it behind. But at the same time, it's not that he intends those particular things, but I mean, I would hope these architects would agree with me. Poetry matters. If it is simply just the facts of the building, it's dead. You can do a tool shed, a garden shed, or you can do a garden shed, right? And the difference between them is it isn't the poetry. And so I think all of them want people to respond. I mean, if they aren't getting the response, then they aren't succeeding in the part that they don't control, but they very much want. I don't know if that helps, or that's, okay. Now, these people desperately look like they need a coffee break or something like that.
We will take a 5-minute break and then we'll come back with our panelists. Please help me thank Dr. Mead.
I do let Bart read everything. Well, I want to make sure I get the facts straight. And he's very good. He doesn't try to get in the way of my interpretation. If I have a fact wrong, a date wrong, or something like that, he'll let me know. He's a good proofreader. You started with Herb Greene. Oh, he's over there now. You gave away just tell. Let it tell, and you told him let us tell. Oh, sure.
Hello and welcome back. My name is Stephanie Pilot. I am the director of the Division of Architecture here at OU. And I want to thank you all for being here. And I also want to note that this entire event is supported by our Presidential Dream Course, which provides funding for special seminars to bring in outside speakers. So we're very grateful to the President's Office for that support. Before we begin our panel discussion, I want to take a moment and tell you about two initiatives that we're currently working on, or one that we're working on and one that we're aspiring to. As Dean Butzer mentioned, we're currently organizing a comprehensive exhibition on the American School that will open in January of 2020 at the Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art here on campus. And the exhibition will be open until April 5th, so January 23rd to April 5th, mark your calendar and plan to come back, please. This exhibition will include over 50 original drawings by students of the American School and architects, practitioners. And I also want to share another initiative that we're just beginning here. So as many of you know, we're fortunate to have the Bruce Goff Chair of Creative Architecture, which supports bringing in distinguished architects from around the world to spend typically 4 days doing workshops with our students. Thanks to people like Jerry Bonebrake, former Dean Rendell Ye, and Laura Warner, who's here with us today, and many others, the Bruce Goff Chair became a reality and remains one of the cornerstones of our program here at OU. It is something that we do that no one else in the country does, to bring in these distinguished practitioners to spend 4 days immersed in design charrettes with our students. So we're incredibly grateful for that support. And we've had architects like Odile Deck, Antoine Prédoc, Brian Phillips, Bart Prince, Sheila Kennedy, Deborah Burke, and many more come to OU with that support. We now aspire to bring in scholars at the beginning of their career. So we are aspiring to create a 2-year-long teaching fellowships for young architects just starting out who want to go into teaching, who are eager to become scholars and teachers. These teaching fellows would spend 2 years here immersed at OU, working with our students, teaching classes. So this fellowship would give these aspiring teachers the time, the space, the creative culture that they need in order to get their start. And we imagine it would also help spread the legacy of the American School around the world, because after 2 years, these young designers and scholars would go on to long, outstanding careers doing excellent things. And they would always look back on their time here as what helped get them started, what gave them their foundation. And I'm thrilled to share with you that our first teaching fellowship has been approved by the Provost's office. So we will have a new teaching fellow this fall, beginning in 2019. And we want to name this fellowship after a man who got his start here at OU, first as a student, and then later as one of our most important teachers. We want to make this the Herb Greene Teaching Fellowship. We're eager to see that this network of fellows that emerges from OU connects their beginnings to the legacy of the American School, and especially to Herb Greene. So this is one of our aspirational projects that we are starting now here at OU, and I'm so excited to share it with you. And now I want to give you all the privilege of hearing from some of those most important American School architects that we've gathered for you here today. And so I want to reintroduce Dr. Christopher Mead, who is going to moderate the panel discussion with them.
Yeah, you're stuck with me again. It's like you stepped in something and you can't get it off your shoe, and I'm back here. But here's the gentleman you wanted to really hear from today. I'm going to try and frame our panel discussion in 4 ways. First, I want to briefly summarize my view of Goff's views on teaching, carefully protecting. I'm not speaking for Mr. Goff. Second, I want to introduce the 4 panelists with a focus on their connections to Bruce Goff. And then third and fourth, overlapping, I have some questions I'd like to ask the panelists, and I've also been given some questions from Stephanie from her students. Because I'm an academic and an intellectual means I take a simple thing and make it complicated, which means that I noticed that some of the questions overlapped. So some of the times I'm going to call on the student if they simply asked a question. If there's more than one student asked the question, I'll ask it, but I will give credit to the students who asked the question. Told you I'd make it complicated, but I just want to give credit where it's due. When it hired Bruce Goff in 1947, I think the University of Oklahoma got lightning in a bottle. Goff was not a conventional choice, far from it. He never went to university, and his training in architecture was almost entirely hands-on. Beyond his apprenticeship in the Tulsa office of Rush, Endicott & Rush, Goff was largely self-taught. And yet, here he was, running a university program in architecture. Wright had to make up his own program. He had the same lack of academic credentials, but he did it on his own. Now, I think it's safe to say, and I can say this because I have spent my career at another public university, so I'm not about to diss OU. I'm University of New Mexico and OU, we're all in the same kettle here. It's safe to say that a more elite school at a more elite university would never have risked its reputation in this way. Most schools are inherently conservative. Even if and when they start out with a radical curriculum, pretty soon their attention and their focus and their energy are on protecting the new status quo that, my God, that worked. Now it's got to be that way forever. A good example of this is the Bauhaus. When it was founded in Germany in 1919, the Bauhaus was revolutionary. By the time the Bauhaus moved to Harvard in 1937, the revolution had become the new orthodox mainstream. So there's no way that an institution like Harvard would ever take a chance on an academic outsider like Bruce Goff. And I have to say that I think Goff returned the compliment. He suspected schools of architecture as much as they suspected him. There was a mutual antipathy going on there. This is what he had to say about how schools treat students. This is in 1968. He wrote, "He, the student, is warned that individualism is dead, and he is warned of the dangers of being influenced by such questionable characters who are outside the school policy. These men are branded as exhibitionists, prima donnas, romantics, and their works are pointed to with ridicule and scorn by the school as good examples of bad examples of what happens when individualism runs rampant. These schools consider these loners as dangerous and are embarrassed by them, for they have proven that creative architecture can be built." A little zinger at the end there. So to hire an architect like Bruce Goff, you had to be ready to take a chance. And you had to be ready to risk your reputation on a loner who stood outside the mainstream. And you had to be ready to expect the unexpected. Now, when Walter Gropius founded the Bauhaus, he had a fully defined program in hand that he then took to Harvard, ready-made and prefabricated. Bruce Goff came to OU without any such program. And in fact, he was opposed to the very idea of such a program. As he explained in 1981, education should be a matter of bringing something creative and individual out of a student instead of packing his head full of prefabricated education, which would make him at best only a follower. I think if Goff had a model of education in mind, it was based not on schools of architecture, but instead on examples like that of Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright. As you probably all know, Wright's education as an architect, after an indistinguished semester at the University of Wisconsin, came almost entirely from his years as a draftsman in the office of Adler and Sullivan. Wright said that he became a pencil in the master's hand as Sullivan leaned over his drafting table and taught him how to design. Like Sullivan teaching Wright, I think Goff saw teaching as something very much the same, as something best conducted directly with each individual student as they worked together on solving a problem of design. It was based on his own experience. Goff's method of teaching made no distinction between teaching in a school and teaching in an architectural office, which is why I think he had as many students after he left OU as he had when he was at OU. All right, so with this context in mind, let me introduce our four distinguished panelists. I start with the very distinguished Herb Greene, who has, and I'll say it again, a distinguished career as an architect, artist, teacher, and writer. And I think the kind of polymathic quality is indicative. Goff was also much more of a polymath. For somebody who was self-educated, he knew a hell of a lot, and I think these people never stop learning. In 1948, Mr. Greene transferred to OU from Syracuse University, I imagine for other reasons than just to escape the winters up there. He came to study with Bruce Goff. Both before and after he graduated in 1952, Mr. Greene also worked for Goff on project drawings, including most famously the Bavinger House. And I hope you forgive me, I couldn't resist putting at least one of your beautiful drawings up there. They are absolutely extraordinary. From there, Mr. Greene went on to work with John Lautner in California before he returned to Oklahoma to teach here from 1957 until 1963. During this period, he designed a number of landmarked houses, including most famously the Prairie House, which is going to remain on the map, I hope, forever. From 1964 till 1982, he then went on to teach at the University of Kentucky. He then retired to Berkeley, but retirement is a relative term. I don't think he retired. He just retired from working in an institution. He has remained very active as a painter and a writer. His most recent book is called Painting the Mental Continuum, Perception and Meaning in the Making. And I have a copy that was given to me by Bart Prince. You thought I should read it. All right. Now, like Mr. Greene, Ernest Burden studied with Goff at OU. In his case, he's transferred from the Rhode Island School of Design, all these refugees from East Coast universities, after he saw Goff's Ford House in Life magazine in March 1951. And here, apparently, you overlapped with Herb Greene. From OU, Mr. Burden went on to practice architecture, first in California and then in New York State. He has had a very rich and diverse career, includes conservation, and I mean nature conservation, preservation, building, planning, as well as, while he added, architectural design. And also, he is a very accomplished architectural delineator. We saw one of his student works, second-year work. I'm still digesting that. Second-year students, you guys got to get to work. You got to see what they used to do in their second year when he was here. A very accomplished architectural delineator who has published numerous books on architectural rendering, design, construction, and preservation. His forthcoming book is Bruce Goff's Design Vocabulary, a synthesis of music, art, and architecture. Arthur Dyson, who I've been wanting to meet for years. I'm kind of a little crush on his architecture for a long time. Arthur Dyson first trained in Frank Lloyd Wright's Taliesin Fellowship, and he remained at Taliesin until the master's death in 1959. While he was there, he worked on the Marin County Civic Center. Then, from 1959 to 1951, Mr. Dyson went to work for Bruce Goff, who was then in Bartlesville. So that's where he got a postgraduate kind of education there. His decision, reportedly, may have something to do with the fact that when he was at Taliesin West, Wright observed that one of Mr. Dyson's projects looked, quote, very Goffian. And so that led him on to search, what is Goffian, what is this about? And he ended up working for Mr. Goff. I also understand while he was working with Goff, he was also finishing his education here at OU. Yes, so we have another connection. Mr. Dyson then returned to California, working for William Gray Purcell, and that's Purcell and Elmsley, if you know your history of this. That's a very famous name, until he opened his own office in Fresno, California. I tell you, these architects are fearless. Given what he's doing, Fresno, California, I grew up in California. I'm still putting this together, but he has succeeded in doing that. Because since he moved there, he has authored a prolific and astounding body of architectural work that responds creatively to the requirements of site, program, and clients. And from 1999 to 2002, he also served as the dean of the Frank Lloyd Wright School of Architecture. Nelson Brackin studied architecture at Auburn University. I think we all now know Auburn because of the rural studio that Sam Mockbee and others established there in 1993. But what matters for our story, it was already known in the 1970s because Robert Faust, who had also studied with Goff, went to teach there and ran his own sort of informal de facto design build program. It was a good place to go get hand-on issues. You got sawdust in your blood, isn't that what you said today?
That's absolutely true.
Yes. And thanks to, so he was at Auburn, thanks to an introduction from Faust, Mr. Brackin then interned for Bruce Goff in Tyler, Texas, the last place that Goff lived, from 1975 until 1978, while he was also completing his studies at Auburn. Since 1980, Mr. Brackin has been a practicing architect in Atlanta, Georgia, working both independently and as a design architect for a long series of firms, multiple firms, yeah. He is also a founding member and past president of the Friends of Quebiar. It was founded in memory of Goff. I assume you all know about that. And just a little aside, but it interests me, he also serves as a tour guide of Old Brass, the plantation in South Carolina, designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. So those are our four distinguished panelists. Let me start with my questions, but what I'm going to do is sort of interleave them with student questions, so we'll bounce around. And partly it just depends upon what the panel discussion goes, what happens. I have questions. I don't know whether we'll get to them all. It really depends what they have to say. I'll overuse the overused metaphor of herding cats, but panel discussions work best when you just let them run and see where they want to go with things. So my questions are really designed to provoke discussions rather than answer anything. I don't have any answers in mind, and my questions are really sort of little mini clusters of questions. So the first one, which I think is self-evident, what made you interested in Bruce Goff? What was it about his architecture that caught your attention? It made you leave wherever you were and made you want to go and study with him or work with him. What did he teach you? Was it worth it? Did he live up to the expectations? What did you learn from him? I want to note here that my question overlaps with a question by Si-Chen Kao, am I pronouncing that, who asked very much. I thought, there's a smart person. Very good question there. So, whoever, it's up to you guys. Don't forget to use the mics.
Just go from right to left.
Okay. That's what got me out of golf was my teacher, Bart Prince, in Auburn. Faust has a studio off, his office open, and you could watch him draw. I would go in there and chat with him about what he was doing and how he was doing it, and he'd tell me stories, and of course golf was central to those stories. And that's what caused me to stop and visit golf. And what I thought was going to be a 2-hour conversation was a 6-hour conversation. And I kept going back to see him and stay there for eventually 3.5 years working with him. And what I learned that I hadn't learned anything before. History and theory was like more history and mystery, but it was golf. He was such a great storyteller. When he was talking about Frank Lloyd Wright, you felt as if Mr. Wright was sitting in the room with you. When he was talking about Debussy, you could feel that Debussy was there. And I mean, we listened to music 100% focused on the music, and you would not believe what you got to hear when you weren't trying to do something else, when you just totally focused one thing at a time. And Goff focused one thing at a time, teaching us the very basics of design and architecture through everything that he did. Thank you.
Ditto. I think I agree with everything that you said, and you said with your introduction that Mr. Wright led me on towards Bruce Goff, but his incredible ability to know his clients and understand his clients and develop a program that was so individual, and the ability to create something that was never there before, creating works that nobody had ever seen before. It was a phenomenal experience, just the opportunity to be with him and then to be introduced to folks like Herb Greene. And I've got to tell you that all of us that grew up in that era, and particularly Harvey Ferrero and myself, we always wanted to be Herb Greene when we grew up.
Yours is working. Well, I was at Syracuse University, and I saw a short article in the Architectural Forum on Goff coming to Oklahoma to take over. So I didn't like Syracuse, so I didn't know how to drive. I drove out with a big Marine who said he wanted to go out and meet an Indian girl who had oil wells. But whether that passed or not, I don't know. But the first time I saw Goff is the one I want to talk about. At that time, the School of Architecture was out at what's called North Base. That was left over from the war, and it was a 2-story wood building. And he decorated the hallway just beautifully. I just went in there, sort of glazed over, and went to his office. He sat us down for about 20 minutes. He talked with not long words. What got me was the way he kind of moved his eyes. I just remember that. But after the 20 minutes of conversation, he talked about architecture and what students should expect, what the students would expect, and let's see now, where was I? Yeah. Well, I came out of there and I said, God, I bet my first genius. And he was. And he was the kindest, most supportive person I've ever known. And I think of him every day. He often used terms of music in criticizing your drawings of architecture. Rhythm, orchestration, terms like that. Debussy was his favorite composer, and Ravel was his second favorite composer. And he played the music at night. He had thousands of records, but he played it Saturday night, and for students, I attended some of those, and that was good. And so it was. He's got to be an inspiration to any. I'm almost tearing up thinking about it. He's got to be an inspiration to anybody who's a student of architecture, because he knew the individuality of the client, the architect, the site, the materials had to be orchestrated together to get architecture. And he talked about it so easily and beautifully. He was the gentlest person you ever saw. Well, let's see. What else should I talk about? He was in the Prairie House, and I'd done that. He was standing upstairs and said, to me, it's like pure feeling, which I thought was a great compliment. But I'm tearing up in my old age, but thinking about Bruce Goff.
Try this one. What brought me to Oklahoma was a copy of Life magazine with the Ford House spread by Elliot Ellison, the photographer, Alyssa Fon. And if you don't know that photograph, you won't know what I'm talking about. If you do know that photograph, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You need nothing more than to look at that photograph and say, that's where I want to study. That is architecture. And I did. I transferred from Rhode Island School of Design in an instant. And not even having the knowledge that Bruce was there, because I wrote to Jerry Hodges, his secretary, and she said, oh yeah, we have this and we have that at the school and so on. Never mentioned BG, never. So I went anyhow, and I never regretted it. And what did he teach me about architecture? Everything.
So I'm going to throw in a question now from the student. Fortunately, the student didn't identify themselves. So we haven't figured out who asked this question. If you're here and you recognize your question, you can stand up and take credit for it, but I'll read it for whoever the student is. But it actually speaks to, we're going to talk a lot about architecture, but another piece of it is architectural drawing. And the students of Goff, but the students of Goff, how they drew was absolutely mind-boggling. Just absolutely extraordinarily beautiful. So this very alert and aware student said, what is the most important factor in architectural drawing? Art's processing that one. But you can interpret that however you want. But we have several experts here in architectural drawing. Who wants to start?
Well, I'm not an expert in architectural drawing. I was intimidated. When I worked with Bruce Goff, Harvey Ferrero was there with me, and he's an incredible delineator. And then I saw the drawings of Herb Greene, and me had these wonderful people to follow. And I'm still to this day intimidated being around these folks. It's difficult to depict architecture two-dimensionally. In today's world, we have digital means of showing things a little more realistically. Bruce Goff really understood the third dimension of architecture and the importance of that, even the fourth dimension. And I can tell you that architecture, I've learned over these years, is more about not so much what you see, but how you process what you see. And through studies in neuroscience, we're learning more and more about that. And that's a very difficult thing to do, and it's a difficult thing, I think, for students to understand. So it's really more about the intangibles, and Goff was able to pull that out of his clients. And that might sound a little esoteric. Let me give you a quick example of what I mean. Originally I became an architect to do work for blue-collar workers, for folks that normally couldn't afford the services of an architect. And my early work was mostly that. My heart is still in that area. But the first time I was at a client's house that really had a great amount of means, they had all of this artwork all over the place. And I said, you know, if you had to evacuate this house at a minute's notice, what would you take? And without hesitation, they both pointed to 2 glass goblets that their children had gotten them. It was the first time the children realized the importance of their wedding anniversary. So, as a diligent architect, we designed a niche to put these goblets in. But at the same time, we created a small clear story on the other side of this room, so that the only time that the sun hit those goblets was at June 5th at 6 p.m., the date and time of their wedding anniversary. So those are the intangibles. Those are things that you can't really see and experience unless you know the background of those clients. Kind of went around the question, didn't I?
Brilliantly.
Let's see. I was working for Goff. In the back of his office was a light screen in back of me. He was talking to a client in front of his desk, and I must say he only talked about practical things. What was going to work, what was going to solve this, where the closets ought to go. And I was surprised. But here's a story. He did a house in Bartlesville for Jones, and Mr. Jones had died. I was on a bus with students, and we came up in front of the house, and I said, Mrs. Jones, I don't know if you remember me, but I was here with Bruce Goff. And she said, oh, wasn't he a wonderful man? And she hustled me into the house. And she had collected small glass figurines, sort of early American or something. And so what Goff did is he had a table about this big, and he took down to there, he came back. You had a fascia where you had the sink and counter. Then he came up 8 inches, the splash. Then he had a glass shelf going out about 15, 16 inches. And then that tipped the glass, sloped back up to the roof. But on that shelf, she could display her figurines. And that's a small example of the attention he gave to clients. And they collect, for God's sake. And they'd say, who had the best house? Who had the best house? I'm sorry, I'm breaking up. It's just, I didn't think I was going to break up. And so I worked for him a long time, mostly doing presentation drawings for him. And well, one thing he could do, he had to pay his apprentices, his students, so he could do an expensive scheme, and then he could do it over again. He came in over the budget. But God, he was such a genius at teaching. He hired Mendel Glickman, who was Frank Lloyd Wright's engineer, to teach structures, because structures were so important to architecture. And Glickman had a good sense of humor. He taught for 3 hours, though I wasn't that much of for structure. But he became head of the school for a while, too. He had a great sense of humor. What else about Bruce Goff? I'll give it to her.
I can remember that BJ used to draw a distinction between a beautiful drawing and a beautiful concept. And he preferred to have a beautiful concept. But even so, a lot of the students, had both. Beautiful concepts, and they delineated them beautifully. So when I went into establish a professional delineation business in my later years, there were two things that I looked for. Number one, you have to balance the artistic with the reality. In other words, are you going to just paint a picture, or are you going to depict the building as it really is in its environment with all of the things that are going to go on with it? And so I've developed and wrote a book about architectural delineation. In other words, depicting accurately what the building is going to be like in its environment, no tricks, but that did not exclude the artistic part of it, which is very important.
What I'd like to mention is that Bruce, the years that I knew him and I worked with him, he would prepare his design ideas on a 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. And as the idea grew, the next piece of paper came next to it, next to it, and next to it. And I would have to take those, I took those pieces of paper and then would prepare a presentation drawing, much like I did for you, Laura, on your house. Another thing that he did that was just so incredible, we worked on the Price house, on the tower, as I called it, the third floor, the windows. And he had these two small little drawings, and it gave the essence of the idea of how those windows were to be. So we had the glass delivered, and we had them laying out on the studio tables, and some of the glass was, we were breaking glass and reassembling it, and these different spiderweb patterns that he wanted. So it was a nice trick to break the glass and pick it up and put it back together again. Some of the spots have little bright red spots in them because I dripped a little bit. But the patterns, he created this gesture of a design. He would come in and explain it to us, what he wanted us to do. And we proceeded to cut out plexiglass and glue and make all of these intricate elements work out into these great joy of light. I was lucky to be there with Bruce the first day they put the glass in, and Joe Price let me come up for the first sunrise to stand in the room and see it all. It was absolutely fantastic. And then at the end, when we finished it, we cleaned it all, and we were there, and we brought some little glass pieces of it, some bits and pieces, and we laid them on the floor, and Joe's daughter discovered them, and so she took them back to Dad to, look what I found. And so Bruce was in on this, and Joe worried about this, I think, for about 3 weeks, trying to figure out where they fell out of the windows. It was a great, great time.
One side note on presentation, and I don't know if BG did this all the time, but during the time I was with him, he never put the room names on the floor plans because he wanted to explain to the client without them reading ahead of him which room he was in and why he was doing it and lead them through the house. I've never seen anybody else do that.
I want to ask just a little follow-up question on the anonymous student's question. Because it occurs to me, since Goff's day, computers have taken over the world. They're a very powerful new tool, and a lot of drawing now happens on computers. Given your own experience and your continuing practice, is there a place for hand drawing? Do we still need it, or is it relevant, or is it just a hobby now?
considered using computers. My great niece Leela works in our office. I think she can use computers. And design. I don't know how anybody would ever do that. Do you use computers, Ernie?
No, I still have a flip phone. No, I gave up the rendering in 1975, but it was picked up by my son, who quickly learned the computer, and now he's doing computer animations. And but what's most important is that he has taken what is a cold process, which is in some cases, very dramatic and so on and so forth. But he's created a software program that makes the computer output watercolor. And so it softens, the harshness and of the images, and it's very successful. Showed me up.
Well, I could never draw like these guys, so I welcome the computer. And to be able to depict something in real time, in real space, on the actual site, I think has some real advantages. We always took we built models and then put them on a heliodon, which would track the sun. So we knew the exact angle of the sun, how much was coming in the house and how it wasn't. Well, we can do that digitally now, so it makes it so much easier. I can tell you, when we designed that clear story to hit those goblets, that took forever to compute that. But to be able to do it now through the computer is a great, great sense. But it's, and you can put your clients in the photographs. So.
I've started drawing everything by hand at the beginning, watching Bob Faust shake drawings out of his sleeve faster than you could think. It's just so incredible. I continue to realize that you got to have the idea. The idea is the most important thing that an architect can come up with. And you begin by sketching that out by hand, and then later you can go to the computer. I've had to teach myself how to do computer things. But thinking of somebody transitioning from hand to computer, I want to mention somebody that Gary McCowan and I both know, Dean Bryant-Vollador. Dean drew all these fantastic perspective drawings, watercolors, everything. Then he's taught himself the computer, and he was doing equally fantastic, beautiful rendering presentations that are equal to what, comparable to everybody we've seen here. But he's somebody that deserves recognition as well.
For what it's worth, my opinion is that hand drawing probably still matters. I think there's a place for it. Computers are incredible tools. The simple metaphor I do is a pencil, if you look at it, it'll just sit there. So you actually have to tell the pencil what to do. The computer, sometimes you think you know when you do a keystroke, and what you're doing is somebody else has solved the problem and you're doing there. So if you learn to push a pencil, then the way you use a computer becomes much smarter. I don't think they replace each other, but it's just a new tool. Anyway. It's a very expensive, yes, and think how expensive a pencil is too, yes. All right, so my second question is, Goff's, and I've talked about this already, but Goff's approach to teaching architecture was based in his practical experience, not in an educational theory. He didn't have a theory of education other than don't trust schools of architecture. Do you think it's possible to turn this approach into an architectural program that outlasts its creator? In other words, to what degree was what happened here dependent first upon Goff and then Herb Greene, and then it just became a school again? How do you actually institutionalize something that is so anti-institutional? How have you, or because some of you have, or how would you actually teach Goff's approach to architecture? How do you go about that? And we can talk about it blithely. given his emphasis on teaching each individual student, how do you actually duplicate that? Because the moment you're duplicating, you aren't doing it anymore. And what lessons can we take away from what Goff accomplished at OU in the 1950s and then continued to practice in his office in the following decades? What could contemporary schools of architecture learn from his example?
Well, I taught for 24 years, and I was very much influenced by my experience with Bruce Goff. And I think it would continue to apply to, for the foreseeable future, which would be 2,000 years anyway. And I was very influenced by it, and it helped. It helped me become a decent teacher, at least, by having studied under Bruce Goff. One thing about my drawings, I'm supposed to be noted for renderings, but my trees are too busy. And the reason for that is I was influenced by a great Russian artist, Pavel Chelychev. Have any ever seen his painting, Hide and Seek? Anybody? Ernie? Anybody? Well, it was up in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. I think I was still a student, and I went there and looked at it for 2 hours. It's about a 5 by 5.5, 6-foot painting, and it's got a big hand, and in that is a world of figures. And between the figures are bright people, children, leaves. It's like the universe he's trying to get in there. And when I saw it, it was years ago, teenagers or class of them were coming, and they were looking at it, and they wouldn't leave it. They were all so excited, and the teachers made them go, had to pull them away from it. I understand. A student of Chelychev is here with us today. Koshkin Uritzin. I get his name wrong. I can't remember my own middle name anymore. It's Roddle, but that reminds me of Doddle. It reminds me of you know who.
Yeah, that painting was so famous. It hung in the Museum of Modern Art permanently for years and years and years. And then it disappeared permanently. Yes, sad. Yeah, they said it had to be restored, but it was so famous that we always used to say, well, I'll meet you by hide and seek. It was a good...
I think you referred to the pedagogy that Goff initiated, and I think that what he was able to do was draw out the individual aspects that you had, rather than, like you said earlier, jam information down somebody, give them the tools. You mentioned Goff's eyes that caught you right away. I always felt his greatest attribute was his ears, his ability to listen. He had an incredible ability to listen to folks and to draw out what they did and to see what was there and what wasn't there. One of the things that, we learn from different sources, and Herb led me to so many folks, to Whitehead and Russell and so many different people that helped me along the way, and other folks outside of the realm of architecture. Maya Angelou, the great poet, talked about building romance about your clients, the importance of that. Robert Frost wrote a metaphorical poem called The Mending Wall. And in that he said, if I were going to build a wall, I would first ask myself 2 questions. What am I walling in and what am I walling out? That's a very simple question that all architects ought to ask themselves when they walk on a site. And I think those things are very teachable tools, and they allow folks to run with that themselves and become themselves and discover who they are. And for the sake of the students out here, each one of you is unique in all the universe. You bring something here that has never been here before and will never, ever be here again. You have a voice within you, a song. Let that song out. Express what you have. Don't take it to your grave with you. Too many architects, and I think Goff even said this one time, their tombstones ought to read, they took it all with them. They left it here. They didn't use it. Use everything you have.
Very good. For me, the teaching ideas from Goff kind of came to me first through Faust. We had what we called a vertical studio. Faust gave us lessons from the 273 class. The 273, of course, is a class number that OU had, and I have later come to learn, how that came about. But Faust gave us these drawing assignments. Later, when I went to work for Bruce, he gave us similar drawing assignments. The point, line, and form, theme, variation, development, site, relation, ornamentation, and rhythm, chiaroscuro, orchestration, many different assignments. I worked for him in the daytime doing drawings, and in the evenings we'd go over, we'd listen to music, and he would give us these assignments. There was always illustrations and other stories that went with the assignments, always a piece of music that got played to exemplify something. Theme, variation, development was a favorite of his that he liked to share, specifically Honegger-specific 231, Ravel's Bolero, and Villa-Lobos, the three great composers who did theme, variation, development like nobody else did. If you want to study architecture and study theme, variation, development, you need to listen to these guys. They knew what they were doing. But Bruce brought all those things to life, and he continued that.
Bruce was on a first-name basis with Duke Ellington. They were friends.
Maud, Bruce's mother, told me the story of how Duke came to town and they tried to go out to eat and they couldn't, so they had to come back to the house. But Maud was a tremendous woman. She shared many stories about Goff as I got to know her and be there.
I believe the most important aspect of Bruce's teaching, BG, was the fact that he was able to synthesize the music, the art, the painting, the sculpture. It was all one to him. There was no difference. And I believe that in an architectural education, that would be necessary to bring all of that back together again, as he did, in some form.
So just listening very carefully to what you're saying, I heard three things. One was my phrase for today, was mental attitude. It's sort of the openness to what somebody was thinking and actually willing to listen to them. That's point one. The second one, of teaching. Oh, to listen. Yes, just to listen. I mean, what? Yes, right. Yeah, what? And then the second one was the fundamentals, basic compositional lessons. I mean, it's sort of, we forget that, but and then the third was not making a distinction between architecture and other art forms. I mean, maybe, am I reading too much into that?
Well, BG started a course called Architecture 273. It was fourth year. You had to do a design problem every week. And I remember saying to some of the students, Herb, work looks like wallpaper. Too repetitive. But then I did a drawing at the end that he kept and sent it to the Art Institute of Chicago, where all his work is located. So all I'm saying is that for me, that was an important course, even though he thought my 9/10 of my work was a wallpaper.
I think what you ask and what Ernie referred to, and this really helped me, and people are always asking, what did you learn most from Bruce Goff? And my minor I was a psych minor, so I always try to find out as much as I can about a client, but BG felt that and taught that all of the arts are fundamentally related, whether it's cinema, dance, photography, architecture, graphic arts, sculpture. And basic elements of composition are common to all of the arts. And so I have a 32-page questionnaire for my residential clients. So embarrassingly, I can tell you that most architects don't know whether their clients are right or left-handed. And I don't know how you can design anything for them if you don't know basic facts. But Goff's feeling was that if you knew, for instance, you have two clients and they both like classical music. One likes Debussy and Stravinsky, and the other likes Beethoven and Bach. One likes something very light and athletic, the other likes something very heavy and monumental. That gives you clues to architecture. So once you develop these clues and you have all of these areas to go to focus your design strength, you're going to come up with something that's different. You're not going to extrapolate something that somebody else did. And I don't think any of us up here, at least, wanted to become architects to repeat what somebody else had already done. And I think that we all had too much respect for Bruce Goff and to try to steal his designs. We had too much respect for Frank Lloyd Wright. He had too much respect for Sullivan. And so it's that ability to try to find that, again, that inner spark that you have. But I think that relationship to all of the arts was really important. It's the one thing that he stressed a lot.
Yeah, those lessons that Goff gave us were more like principles of design, which are just of any kind of design, any kind of creative ideas or creativity that people do, all carry these same basic ideas. The basic principles are there. And those are learnable by, in kindergarten blocks.
So is Ryan Godfrey here? Yeah? Well, Ryan, you want to ask your question? You've asked it to Mr. Dyson, but if you can make it sort of all the panelists, I think they can all deal with your question. You can go ahead. Oh, come on.
It's okay, I forgot what I was going to say.
Okay, all right. So so we all acknowledging the author of Ryan back there. His question is, did you audit any courses at the University of Oklahoma? And if so, which ones? Can you tell us a bit about your impression of the courses, environment, assignments, and so on? What was it like to go to OU?
Well, I did because of the fact that I was working for BG at the time, but I was coming here twice a week. And through the grace of Herb and Mary, I spent many nights on their couch. Going back and forth and working with mainly Mendel on structures. Oh, I'm sorry.
No.
I need to talk to him. So going back and forth, we called it monitoring classes back then. Now it's auditing classes, and allowed me to do that to continue my education. But that was in the School of Philosophy, not architecture, because of the folks that I was surrounded by. So.
I never went to Oklahoma, but I had Bruce Goff as a teacher, and my early structural designs were because of Palmer Boggs. He sat down with me and explained to me what I should have learned already, but he was a great teacher as well. So I had Palmer and Bruce.
So you went to OU, you just didn't know you were going to OU when you were... Have any of the two people who actually took courses back then?
Did I monitor any of the courses?
No, it's more, I think, Ryan, you can jump in here, but I think you want to know what it was like to be a student, right? And what the courses were like, and, no?
I got it now. The learning environment was intense, and it went from dawn till midnight, 365 days a year, maybe give or take a few. The architecture school closed at midnight. And we locked everything up. We went to Rex's donut shop, and there we listened to more stories. So it was a very intense environment, a very intense learning environment, but a very creative learning environment. And perhaps one of the best experiences of my life.
Mr. Greene doesn't want to touch that one? Okay, all right. So I'll ask another of my question. This is something that came up since Donald McDonald made this claim in 1981. People have been saying that Goff created an American School of Architecture.
You said that Donald?
Donald McDonald? Yeah. Now, this claim to me suggests that Goff was working in a vacuum, that all the other schools in the United States were based on imported European models. Now, to be honest, I'm just trying to provoke you guys a little bit, but I think this ignores some obvious precedents. Wright's Taliesin Fellowship comes to mind. So does Auburn University. And we could go on, it becomes a game, how many you want to name. So rather than working in a vacuum, it seems to me that Goff was working within a larger tradition that includes not only Taliesin, but Soleri's Cosanti and Arcosanti, Auburn's Rural Studio, and we can name other things. So apart from their shared skepticism of the European Academy, these schools share a common commitment to design build as a key to our teaching architecture. Do you think I'm way off base there, or is there something there? Where does Goff's American School fit into the larger picture of teaching architecture in the United States? In other words, if we recreate this, can it only happen at OU and nowhere else because the only place it's allowed to happen? Does it fit, or does it belong in a category all by itself? What are we talking about with the American School?
Well, I embrace Don McDonald's voice, and I know Don, he's a good friend. He did some good architecture in San Francisco. And then he became a bridge specialist. He did the Bay Bridge, the new part, and it's nice, it's good. He's done masterpiece bridges around the world now. And that is connected to Bruce Goff. Because he admired the school and wanted to come here. He was from Canada, I think Montreal. He was in my first class as a teacher, but he wouldn't listen to me. That's why he went so far, really.
Well, I believe that the school that BG created and that Frank Lloyd Wright created were total opposites.
Opposites.
Yes, total opposites. Whereas if Frank Lloyd Wright created something that he liked, BG created something that we liked.
I remember talking to Goff about Frank Lloyd Wright, and he thought that he had kind of an inferiority complex. His dad left when he was a teenager, and he was very short. And he has his need for self-importance. And it's not to criticize Wright. He's a terrific genius, and Taliesin West is the finest assemblage of buildings I've ever seen in my life. But so you can be a genius and have an inferiority complex.
Arthur, you want to touch that?
You know, I can tell you that at the time, we lived in a different world, too, when Frank Lloyd Wright lived, and of course, his school was not accredited. You can't practice today if you don't get a degree from an accredited school. So Taliesin up theirs, and, you know, it's now accredited. And OU was way ahead of the curve in doing that, but I didn't know what to expect when I came here. Because I hadn't been here for a long time. And I'm really impressed with the commitment that I think that the faculty and staff have here. And I see a real future for OU, offering something that you probably can't get any place else in the world, because most universities, particularly colleges of architecture, now are trade schools, teaching individuals how to make a living in an architect's office, not the philosophy of architecture and how you create architecture.
Well, I don't know how this pertains, but this thought that
all pertains.
everything pertains. That's one thing Bruce said. Everything pertains. Everything is there. But in going to school and what you learn, it's what you do with it. You can go to Harvard and be a dunce, and you can go to the smallest school here in the state or any state and become a genius in Einstein. It's all your own curiosity and what you do. And one thing that Bruce had was just an insatiable curiosity.
I think, and I think that's very true, that BG had a great curiosity, Frank Lloyd Wright had a great curiosity, and you'd mentioned something or asked something about, we all knew students that had great potential, had great talent, but they never seemed to use it. That never manifested itself when they got out into practice. I don't know why that is. Maybe it's a lack of curiosity. I've always thought that, and I mentioned the other day, I thought it was determination and perseverance. But of course, my wife pointed out right away that those are synonyms for stubbornness. But whatever it is, I think that that's really important, that you have that, because you're going to have 1,000 people that are going to tell you why you can't do something. And you're going to have many people that are going to repeat that. You need to find a way that you can do something. If you really believe in your dreams and you want to build something, you have to have the persistence to push that through. Because I think that's a big important part of that. It's not talent alone. There's certainly many, many people have much more talent than I've ever had. They never did anything with it.
That brings me up to one of Goff's most talented students. And to me, he was an influence on the Prairie House. He, after college, he went in the Air Force. And 3 years after that, he got out and was working in Canada for an architect. He did a series of drawings, and one of them influenced the Prairie House, and I published it in several books to try to show the analogy. And I don't have it on hand, so you can't see it, but it's just indescribably beautiful, and it seems to have no center. Like Frank Lloyd Wright, there's a center, and then there's wings going, extended wings going out from the center. And Herb made this beautiful thing that you couldn't find a center in it. I thought he was the greatest genius, and he never built a damn thing. He had an office and he built some work, but it was undistinguished. And how he had that genius and never used it is amazing to me. And because it's an influence on the Prairie House, I thought I'd bring it up.
I think getting back to the point of can this only happen in one place? Can it happen here? Can it happen anywhere? BG's primary goal in teaching was to make sure that we understood what architecture with a capital A was all about. And most schools don't even know what that means. So I would say that that was an extremely important factor to him. And it takes a whole culture of a school to achieve that. So I believe that you have the basis here, you have everything in the right direction, so go for it.
Do you want to say something, Arthur? So listening to you, I'm a recovering academic, recovering administrator, so these questions are, I think what they're trying to do is a very brave thing, but I think it's difficult because you don't call back Bruce Goff and say, all right, come here and teach, which solves the problem. So my question is really, if he's not here, I mean, I take Ernie's point that it was very different because he wasn't Frank Lloyd Wright, it was Bruce Goff, but that avoids the question. So is it a question of how you teach or what you teach?
Well, got up and took the bus out to the architecture school at 8 o'clock in the morning. He left at 11 o'clock, and I went to a coffee shop, usually with half a dozen or so students with him. And he said he wasn't going to sleep a third of his life away. So at about 12:30 he left, and he went down to his studio, and he had, I think, Bob Faust, who some of you are familiar with, was staying with him for a couple of years. Yeah. And where was I? Geez, really, I hit that in an old age home.
You don't want to touch that question? I mean, because you've dealt with that when you were dean at Taliesin, trying to bring it from one world to another world, which they're trying to deal with here.
Well, that was 1999 to 2002.
Wow.
I was a teenager. Yeah, right. Yeah, Jung talks about the inner child, the divine child, the inner child, the child within. If my wife were here, she'd tell you I have more child within than any one person should have. But there actually is something about our youth that's really an important part of it. It's certainly a part of our clients that are really important, their upbringing and what they did. But back to the school and where it goes, it isn't easy, it's difficult, but I don't know of anything that's really worth doing that's not difficult. And I love getting projects that are difficult. I enjoy that, but I even get greater satisfaction out of getting a project that's impossible. When you achieve that, you've really achieved something. I don't think this is impossible, but I think that you have the nucleus here to do that, and you have folks to reach out to that can assist. You know, certainly the people here, Gary McCowan out here. You have folks that are in semi-retirement that you can always reach out to as advisor. Bob Faust, Harvey Ferrero, Bart Prince. I mean, a lot of young architects. Wally Cunningham. Gosh, I'm going to forget half of them. Bob Oschatz. Yeah, some wonderful people out there. So just go after it. Just roll your sleeves up, and we're all here to help you. You know, we're all. You introduced this, but sometimes you'll go to different places and they'll ask you for a self-introduction. And this sounds funny, but it's not meant really to be funny. It's true. I'm an architect in training. I mean, I've always felt that way. You always learn. That's the great thing about architecture. You're always learning. You're learning more, and you know, about the work that you produce. When I design a project and I finish it, I look at it and I ask myself questions like, what would Herb Greene think of this? What would Frank Lloyd Wright think of this? What would Bruce Goff think of this? Is this worthy, you know, of them? Is it really the best that I can do? Those things are important. So these folks that you look up to are always there.
You know, I'd like to come back to the point of, you know, what can you do to create the same environment? Herb remembers, I remember, everybody who walked into the North Campus remembers the impact of the environment that Bruce Goff created. The string on the ceiling, the black Celotex walls, the drawings on the wall. The drawings on the wall are probably the most important thing you could do. I'm looking now at a Faust drawing out there, okay? If all of the drawings that were done during Bruce Goff's time were hung up around this building, this college, things would change overnight.
Goff had black painted boards painted on the wall that would hang up student work. And what he did was he hung up not just the good work, but all the students.
Yeah, everybody.
Everybody's work was hung up. And I never figured out the exact significance of that, but it's important.
Bruce used to talk about how at the North Base and all the student work was there. Bob Faust talked about the first time he went in there and he got to see this young man's drawings there, which convinced him to move from Tulane up to OU, and how powerful that was, and the environment that Bruce had created there. I mean, these guys are the living legacies right here of Goff, and that's the people that you need. Is you need to continue making those connections to the living legacies.
Faust supervised the construction of a couple of Goff houses down on the Gulf Coast.
Gutman and Ryder houses.
I think they got lost in hurricanes.
Only
One of them got lost in a fire.
yeah, one got burned in a fire, and the other one, the son of the owner is still living there.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
No, I got that wrong. Good. Thanks.
No, I think a part of that whole environment, too, is the way that you conduct yourselves in the school itself. We've all been to critiques. Gary, you know that, at North Carolina. I was at design critique with Robert Campbell and Adele Santos and a lot of the elite from the East Coast schools, and they ripped into students' work. I think they ripped the projects apart, and so these are final students presenting their work in front of their parents, their grandparents, their siblings, and these are students that are ready to go out into practice. Goff was very good at not giving anybody false hope, but finding something good in that project and telling them to take that part of that and expand that, but not to run folks down. Give them the confidence to reach out and do something. I think that's a real important part of that.
Yes.
I forgot the rest of what I was going to say. Catching.
What?
They're talking about students.
Go ahead.
Jim Gresham was a student, I think, who was from Michigan or thing. Anyway, we had the same apartment together, and he was a very talented architect. He went to Tucson and did 2 parking structures for the university and 2 other large buildings for the University of Arizona. And Jim he won the Rome Prize, and Goff and Wright didn't like that idea. They didn't like the influence of the Renaissance, European Renaissance at all. So I just downplayed it. But he came back, and he did a small room. I forget what the purpose of it was, but it was very beautiful. Fine textured ceiling, draped, and the walls were also suspended. And it was such a beautiful space, I can't describe it, but people, when they get married there, and use it for lots of other purposes. And it was about, an eighth as large as this space is.
I'd like to make the point that BG eliminated the crit, the architectural crit, which was in existence for many years and probably exists in many schools today. If somebody criticizes your work, well, that was unheard of. Instructors never told you one way or the other. In my interview this morning with Luca, I made the point that one of the instructors came over to a student who was working on a drawing on a watercolor, and he didn't like the way it was going. So he said, hey, give me a brush, any brush. And the student handed him an architect's desk brush.
How's our time doing? About 10 more minutes. So the next question is, Jose Aguirre, is Jose here? No? Is Emily here? Emily's back there, hiding back there? Well, they asked a very similar questions, so I'm going to combine their questions into one. One was for Art Dyson, the other was for Nelson Brackin, but it really applies to everybody, so I'll generalize it. Part of what we're talking about is regionalism, of a sense of place and being grounded. So one way or another, you guys all ended up in Oklahoma or Texas, but I mean, you were here. But you've also lived in all parts of the country. You've lived all over, California, New York, so on. Why did you decide to live and practice where you did? I mean, why did you came here, then you left here? Does it matter where you work? What?
You talking to me?
Yeah, Fresno.
Well, I ended up, actually, when I was married, we moved to Carmel, which is on the coast, beautiful place. And hardly any work there, but there was work in Fresno, so we were on our way to Fresno. I grew up in Southern California, so I was a beach boy. And my wife grew up in the Bay Area, so we're both coastal people. And we moved there for what we thought was going to be a year, and that was decades ago. Never got out of there. It was really interesting because I work in an area that has an agricultural base. So I work with folks that work in the fields and work in the it's an interesting economy. And John Lautner and I would get together often. He had a little place in Three Rivers. And like I was telling you, we like to go out and we'd go up to Sequoia National Forest and tell stories to each other. And, and John thought that I was very fortunate because I worked with people that were grounded. They were farmers, and they understood the earth, and they produced something valuable. I thought he was really fortunate because he worked in an artistic community, worked in Hollywood, and there were folks that understood the arts and wanted something more expressionistic. And he felt that they were all superficial and phony people. So you work with what you have. It always looks a little more flattering in another area. One of the areas for me that was not the greatest is that it's very conservative, very traditional. So it was very hard for an architect that does something different to practice there. I probably wouldn't have chosen that again, but it did work out. So there are ups and downs to.
Well, I went to Auburn because I went to high school in Alabama, and Auburn was the land-grant college in the state, and that's why I went to Auburn. Why did I go to Atlanta? That was the nearest big city, and it was 1980. It was a recession, so I looked at Atlanta and several other cities, but ended up in a job in Atlanta. I worked for several firms there, different alphabet soups, as I call them. We did many nice projects, some really nice ones in Kentucky and there in Atlanta. Also did projects out in Arizona, Indiana, many different places. So it was a good time. But the best time was just when I was in school and got to be out in Texas, in Tyler, and coming here and being invited to be here, and I'm honored, and thank you very much. I've done a Renaissance tour. I've come through Tyler again to see Faye Jones, who was a great friend, and then to Bartlesville and everything else, to seeing as many Bruce Goffs as I could. So, and even got to see one of the best Herb Greenes.
I remember being in Los Angeles working for John Lautner. He had his office in a four-car garage. His office was down below, and upstairs was enough space for. We had beds. Alvin Wiley, who was from Taliesin, was there, and John wouldn't pay us anything. But what was so great about it is he had a two-door coupe, an old car, with a long trunk, and he took us. Alvin and I got in the back and held up the trunk door with a 2x4, and then he'd drive us all over Los Angeles. But what I remember architecturally about Lautner is that he did a house that was on a kind of a peaky place, and the house was painted sort of dark brick red. And one of the walls slid open. You could open it out. It's about 12, 15 feet wide, and open it up to the countryside, open it up to the atmosphere. And he did a rectangular house at the a beach site south of Los Angeles. Same thing, a front wall about 25 feet wide, but could swing out. And I'd never seen that done before, and I liked it.
Well, I left Norman after getting out of school, went west. Since I'd come from the east, I didn't want to go back there. That's where I fled to begin with. So did my time as an apprentice, got my license, did some buildings, and then all of a sudden I decided that I should publish a lot of the things that I'm doing and that other people are doing. And so I made a proposal to McGraw-Hill to publish a book which I called Architectural Delineation. Nobody had ever heard of the word before, you know. And I sent it out to 25 publishers, and I got 24 rejections. But one of them said, I think we could do something here. So on that basis alone, I moved from San Francisco to New York without a contract, but signed it up within a few months after I arrived. So that was the journey.
Yeah, Ernie, I think you should mention what you're doing now.
Well, what I'm doing now, with the help of Nelson, is that I'm writing, it's come full circle. It's come full circle. I am now writing a book about BG. Bruce Goff's design vocabulary, synthesis of music, art, and architecture. So that'll be available starting June 8 on Mr. Goff's 115th birthday.
Goff died young. He was like 78 years old. And he put his cat in the refrigerator. And that was a sign that something was wrong. And Bob Bowlby, Toby Bowlby, his wife, said that Goff spent so much time working alone in a small chamber, gluing sequins on his compositions, that he inhaled this glue from, and she said that could have gotten to him, which is too bad. He should have lived about 10 years more at least.
So reading between the lines of your answers to the student's question, it sounds like there's a paradox here. In other words, where you practice matters, but it doesn't matter. It really matters what you do wherever you are. So it doesn't have to be here. It doesn't have to be in California. There's probably some places where it may be easier to do, but you just make it work. If you can make it work in Fresno, you can make it work anywhere, isn't it? Yeah, right?
That's true. We were talking earlier, too, about the fact that if you wait for the ideal client to walk through your door, that's never going to happen. If you were looking for a client that's got all the money in the world and wants you to be as creative as possible, you'll be waiting your entire life. You do what you can with what you have. And you always want to lead your clients forward. You want to give them something more than they came in for. And a lot of times that's trying to convince folks that they are special, that they deserve something better. When I started my practice, very few people knew who I was. Once they started seeing the work and I became identified with what I did, often they would come in and say right away, well, we're just average people. We don't want anything too different. And you almost have to turn that around. You almost have to hold a mirror up to them, and when they come in and say, hey, don't say any more. When they say, we've seen your work, you're so average, you wouldn't want anything different. And, kind of almost throw that back at them. But it's really important to let people know that they are special and that they need something above what an average person lives in.
Yeah, I think Bruce said that pretty good. when he talked to Mr. Comer asked him what style house he was going to do. This was in Dewey, Oklahoma. And he said, well, the Comer style. The Comer style.
They came in off the street,
Yeah, and
and it was good.
yeah, it's spectacular. It's being restored now, and it's just Miss Naylor is doing a perfect, wonderful job there in the house. I got to see things that, the skylights that have been closed over, she's reopened them and got them secured again. Excellent, excellent, excellent. And seeing some of the things I got to see in the Comer house, reminds me that one of Goff's great things was he was always creating a surprise. He was creating a sense of mystery about the space and a surprise. So every day that you were living in it, every time you got to see it or experience it, there was always something new.
Well said. The Comer house was symmetrical, and inside it was a pleasant plan, but outside, he had a big carport suspended, which really had a contrast, but still related. But it certainly had surprise.
I think one of the qualities of students are questions I didn't get to, because some are very good questions here, but they should ask their questions of them individually. I think Stephanie's looking at me signaling that we're going to end on this, so let's thank the panelists.